this video is going to be a compilation of a few of my previous film analysis and movie criticism videos. If you're looking for totally new content, I actually just released two entirely new videos on my channel this month. So if you go on my channel and look at my past videos, you could check those out maybe, please. If you're here for some movie reviews, if you want some kind of deep dive film analysis, maybe to help you fall asleep, well then that's what this video is for. I think there's going to be about 3 hours of content here, and it's going to be a lot of really, I think, yes, granular, yes, highly detailed, but also I hope pretty interesting takes on some classic and maybe not so classic films. So just to give you a quick outline here of what you have to look forward to, the first two sections of this video are deep dives into Andrei Tarkovsky's film Mirror. What I think is like perhaps the greatest film by one of the greatest directors ever. And in the first section, it's more of a thematic overview of the film, more of my general thoughts about the film. The second section is a deep dive, I would argue a really, really, really deep dive into a single scene from the film that I think really captures some of its themes, some of its ideas, and that is honestly just Tarkovsky at his best. Meanwhile, the third section of the video is about the great Japanese horror film Kwaidan, and really digs into what makes this film so scary and I think a truly unconventional and beautiful way. And then the third section is a look at the classic Christmas film A Miracle on 34th Street, and it's through kind of an odd lens. What I do is I take the film and I find some weird little parallels between it and the HBO prestige drama series The Wire. So that's an odd one, and I hope you stick around for that. And then the final section, the very final section of the video, is my review of Ridley Scott's film Napoleon. So that one's a little bit more modern, and maybe my feelings about it were a little more mixed than some of the other films, but you'll have to stay tuned for that. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Sweet dreams, maybe. So this video is the first in what I hope will be a series of videos looking at great artistic works and trying to puzzle out what exactly it is that makes them beautiful. Now, the first great work of art that I want to look at is the 1975 film Mirror by the late, great Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky is probably best known for his two epic and influential science fiction films, Stalker and Solaris, but in my opinion, Mirror is easily the equal of either of those films, and I believe one of the most beautiful films ever made. But, and let me just say this right up front, Mirror is also a deeply confusing and often bewildering film. Imagine a movie not only set, but filmed from deep within the human subconscious mind. And you have a pretty good idea of what Mirror is. It's a film full of memories and dreams that often bleed together in a way that makes it unclear where reality ends and fantasy begins. It's a film that's full of deeply surreal and often very symbolic shots that are also filmed in a series of dramatically different styles. You have some shots that are filmed in color, other that are filmed in black and white, some that are presented as kind of sepia-toned newsreel footage, and all of these different styles are switched between interchangeably. They're all kind of mixed together. Superficially, the film is anchored around the life of a single character, but the way it handles that life, the way it explores the life of that character, is anything but straightforward. For one thing, the events of his life are presented completely out of chronological order. The film jumps freely between his childhood and his adolescence and his adulthood. But even beyond that, the film does a lot of additional things to obscure our understanding of this man and our ability to see his life clearly. For example, during the scenes where he's an adult, he's kept entirely off screen or almost entirely off screen, almost as if you're viewing those scenes directly from his first person perspective, but not exactly, because the camera moves a little more freely than that. But the film goes through great lengths to not show his face clearly when he's an adult, which is a very weird thing for films, especially films that are fixated intimately on a human being's life, to do. You would think the natural thing would be to have a lot of close-ups and a lot of reaction shots and a lot of opportunities for the actor portraying this character to show you who he is through the emotion evident on his face, right? But instead, the film chooses to do everything in its power to not show you his face, to not let you see him in a clear and unambiguous way, at least as an adult. And in addition to that, there are many moments where the film will leave his perspective entirely, where it will suddenly become unhooked from his experiences and will be watching an experience that, say, his mother had that he couldn't possibly have seen, or will be watching the struggles of his son, even though he's not present in the scene. And the film even leaves his family entirely in a few moments to instead focus on like historical events, things that happened in Russian history. And that's where the newsreel footage comes in. So there's this weird tension in the film between deeply intimate moments that are very much very far inside this one man's head, and these other scenes that are much more loosely related to his life and to his personal experience. And so if you're a viewer watching this film, especially for the first time, it can be a hugely disorienting experience. Think about it, just one of those techniques that I listed off would be confusing in and of itself. Now imagine all of them operating at once in the same movie. And that movie is only about an hour and 45 minutes long. So it's not even as if this is an epic film where all of these different disorienting and potentially alienating tactics are slowly unveiled over the course of its runtime. Instead, this is a really concentrated dose of pure confusion and pure bewilderment. But I think that's entirely intentional, because one of the film's central themes is failed communication. The movie is full of scenes where characters simply fail to effectively communicate what they're thinking or feeling to each other. And the movie is especially full of moments of failed communication within families and within generations. You have multiple scenes in the movie where the central character bemoans the fact that he feels like he's losing touch with his mother. You have a phone call between him and his mother where they're both obviously trying to communicate something deeply important to them. He's trying to tell his mother about how he's been feeling, and she's trying to tell him about the death of a close friend of hers. And the conversation just breaks down. They just cannot talk to each other. And later in the film, you have similar scenes between the central character and his ex-wife and his son. He seems to be so totally and even cruelly out of touch with his son's life. You have moments where he's just really scathing in the way that he talks about his adolescent son. And in fact, a lot more screen time is spent between him and his ex-wife talking about how he can't understand his son than actually trying to communicate to his son. And all of this is really highlighted and underscored by a kind of fascinating artistic choice that Tarkovsky makes. And that's to have poems that were written by his father, Tarkovsky's father, read at different points in the film. But the way this poetry is presented and framed within the film
is really interesting and really unusual. So what you might expect is for Tarkovsky to place these readings of his father's poems over scenes in the movie where they're a really good thematic fit. Where, hypothetically, he might have, say, a love poem read over a romantic moment between, the central character and his wife. Or you might have a poem about the beauty of childhood read over this really intimate scene between the young version of the character and his mother or something like that. But that is not what Tarkovsky does at all. Not in the slightest. Instead, these poems are often deeply at odds with what's going on the screen while they're being read. For example, there's this deeply optimistic poem that seems to be about immortality and about human resilience and about the beauty and nobility of human life. And it is read over this really grueling and depressing and demoralizing bleak newsreel footage of Russian soldiers from World War I just hauling around heavy artillery through the mud, through just deeply adverse conditions. It's not even glorious, heroic battle sequences or anything. It's just grueling scenes of agonizing human labor in the midst of war. And it's such an odd contrast. And whenever Tarkovsky's father's poems pop up in the movie, there's always this sense of contrast and conflict, and this sense of his father's words being somewhat or very out of step with the artistic choices his son is making as a director. And that, to me, was really weird the first time I watched the film. I was like, I don't understand. The words I'm seeing on the screen and the images I'm seeing on the screen. I'm seeing the words on the screen because I'm watching it subtitled because I don't speak Russian, of course. But these words I'm seeing, these words I'm reading, and these images that I'm seeing accompany them feel totally out of step with each other. What's going on? But once you realize that this is a film that in a really essential and fundamental way is about generations struggling to communicate with each other and failing, about how the memories and experiences and dreams and ideals of a father or a mother might be at a total disconnect from the same feelings and dreams and ideals of a child, and that child, when they grow up, may end up thinking and feeling and dreaming and hoping for things and having experiences that are at a total disconnect and totally divided from the experiences of their own child. And that may continue from generation to generation to generation. Then you're like, oh, this choice that Tarkovsky made actually makes a lot of sense. He's actually showing us that this disconnect exists even in his own life, even in his own relationship with his father. And that just adds another layer of just purely heartbreaking intimacy to everything that's happening in this movie. And indeed, if the film stopped there, this would be a pretty bleak and pretty sad and pretty depressing film. But it's not. It's not at all. It's actually, in some ways, a really profoundly moving and uplifting, and by its conclusion, oddly optimistic movie. And that's because Tarkovsky does not just give in, does not just surrender to miscommunication, doesn't just throw up his hands and say, well, I guess we can't ever really know another human being, so to hell with it. Here's your bleak existential film, get out of here. No, not at all. Instead, Tarkovsky is really, in this film, invested in trying to find a way across that vast void of miscommunication that separates human individuals from each other. In many ways, the film actually plays out almost as a search for universal language, as a real attempt to find the words or images necessary to communicate real truth and real feeling and real authentic experience between individuals and between generations, in spite of that tremendous divide that lies between us and the tremendous distance that we all struggle to cross when we're trying to connect to another human being and really express ourselves. And this is evident even in the first scene of the film. So the film opens with a sequence about this adolescent boy who has a severe stutter and who is being treated for that stutter by a hypnotist. And we watch as this boy first struggles to communicate. We see him being asked to try to speak, and we watch him stutter and struggle, and we see the anguish that brings him. And then we watch as he's hypnotized, as he's like drawn out of his consciousness. And then after he's hypnotized, the hypnotist asks him to speak, and he's able to communicate clearly. And so what does that say about the film? What does that say about the intentions of the film? What does that say about what Tarkovsky is trying to accomplish? Well, yes, it gets into that idea of a struggle to communicate, a struggle to really be able to express ourselves and what it means to be a single, unique human individual to other people. But, as I said before, it doesn't end there. If this was just a movie about that, about how impossible it is to connect with others, if it was just about how vain it is and how impossibly difficult it is to try to communicate our real, authentic thoughts and feelings to other human beings, it would end with the poor kid stuttering, with the poor kid struggling to speak. But instead, we watch him be hypnotized, and we watch him discover the means to communicate. And I'm going to offer that that's really what the film does to us as an audience. We're presented, first off, with that impossible struggle to communicate that I've talked about at length at this point. But then the movie draws us in. The movie hypnotizes us. The movie draws us out of our own ego and our own identity and our own rigid, narrow, anxious, self-obsessed self and into this larger, deeper world that exists outside of ourselves. And by the end of the film, I think we've arrived at a place where we feel like something profound has been shared, something profound has been communicated. And I think the universal language that Tarkovsky finds, the tool that he uses to hypnotize us, is beauty. Because this film is just full of gorgeous images. But it goes beyond that, because it's not simply a slideshow of picturesque landscapes or of, close-ups of beautiful faces or something. Instead, what I think Tarkovsky is in pursuit of is a kind of universal, shared, and deeply spiritual sense of beauty. He wants to find transcendental beauty, beauty that transcends the single human being's tastes and experiences. And I think that he arrives at that through a few different techniques, and more than techniques, by reusing a few different motifs and a few different kinds of images and kinds of symbols throughout the film. One of these great universal sources of beauty that Tarkovsky really focuses on and hones in on and repeats again and again throughout the film is a kind of elemental beauty, a beauty that's rooted in the basic elements that surround us, that are part of every human being's life. And in particular, the film is full of scenes of wind, water, and fire. You get wind in the movie very early on. There's this shot where a man is standing in a field full of high grass, and the wind just whips across the field and moves every individual blade of grass one by one. Every plant in this field just shimmers and moves. And it's almost as if, like, a giant breathed on this set. It's almost as if you're seeing the breath of God kind of expelled and just ripple through this field. And that image is repeated multiple times throughout the film. And similarly, this film is full of water, and especially running water, and especially rain. There are so many sequences in this film that are set during rainstorms, or where you're inside a building observing rain through the window on the other side of the building, or characters standing out in the rain, characters running through the rain, rain that materializes out of nowhere. And there are also scenes where it will be raining inside of houses, where water will just be dripping down the walls and off of the ceilings of interiors of buildings. And then fire crops up again and again and again throughout the film. In fact, one of the most iconic images from the film is of a woman watching a barn burn. And we get multiple other fires that are central to other scenes in the movie, whether it's bonfires or fires in fireplaces or whatever. And in addition to that, there are multiple scenes throughout the film that mix water and fire, especially rain and fire. You have a couple of scenes where it's raining, but there's also a fire burning in the foreground or in a place that's central to the viewer's attention, that's central to the shot. So what's going on with all this wind and rain and fire? Well, I think this is part of that pursuit of this kind of universal language of the profound and the beautiful. Because if you think about it, just about every human being who has ever lived has had a moment in their life where they were either in awe of the power of fire, or soothed by the sound of rain, or simply moved by the sight of wind stirring in the trees. These are shared sources of powerful emotion. These are emotional signifiers that transcend any one human being's life. These are things that we can all, I think, kind of universally agree are beautiful, or things that have moved all of us at some point. And more than that, wind and rain and fire have been imbued with real spiritual significance by human beings throughout history and throughout different cultures and civilizations. I mean, what was it that descended upon the apostles at Pentecost, according to the Christian tradition, and gave them the power to speak in tongues, the power to break out of their limited language and really share their experience with people throughout the world? Well, it was tongues of fire. And of course, that's just one small example of the many, many ways that these elemental forces have been framed as something of real spiritual and religious significance. And in fact, Tarkovsky references another instance right within the film itself. He talks about Moses and the burning bush, which of course was another instance where there's this moment of real impossible communication. God speaks to Moses through the burning bush. But within the film, it's presented in a little bit more of an ambiguous and different light. Because what happens is the central character, Alexei, is observing his son setting fire to a bush outside the window, and he asks his ex-wife who it was in scripture who had the experience with the burning bush. And for a moment, neither of them can remember that it was Moses. And it's fascinating because it's another instance of failed communication. And in fact, after they finally remember that it was Moses, one of them expresses that they wish they could have that sort of experience. They bemoan the fact that they've never had that kind of clear and profound religious experience where something is just revealed to them in that sort of divine way. So you have this return to the theme of failed communication framed within this universal symbol that communicates its meaning clearly to us, that communicates through its intense beauty and through its simplicity, through the way that it channels an experience of awe that we've all had. And Tarkovsky does a similar thing with milk and with food in this film. You get a lot of these beautiful shots of tables that are set with food, of people sitting down to eat, and you have many shots in the movie that incorporate milk in one way or another. You see milk spilled on tables. You see a child holding a jug of milk at another moment. You see a woman who has just finished milking a cow carrying the tray of milk. You see all of these images of milk and food incorporated throughout the film. And these images of food and milk are often presented in this gorgeously framed way that almost makes them look like still life paintings. And so why feature these images of milk and food so prominently in the film? Well, and you can probably almost guess this, but that's another shared universal source of beauty and meaning and feeling. Because we all need to eat. I mean, that goes without saying, right? And milk is the first food that we ever have. Milk is the closest thing to a wellspring of human life, to the essential and most fundamental source of human nourishment imaginable. And so milk and food serve as another shared source of reference, another shared source of beauty, and another way for us to recognize something essential and shared about our humanity in this film. Another way in which this film is able to speak in simple terms and in beautiful terms to everyone in its audience, to everyone who is sitting down and watching it. And of course, food is something that's been imbued with deep spiritual significance as well. The Eucharist is central to Catholicism. The sacrament of communion is central to a lot of Christian denominations. And indeed, many other religions have rituals surrounding the preparation and consumption of food. Think of Passover. Think of the way that fasts and feasts are central to Islam. Going back to the most ancient and primal religions, animal sacrifice is present. And animal sacrifice is deeply tied to sources of food. And in fact, animal sacrifices were often about ensuring the arrival of the harvest, and were often tied deeply to harvest time. And many religious feast days are called feast days for a reason, and often are closely intertwined with the harvest and with actual physical meals experienced between human beings, and experiences this kind of great shared spiritual and communal moment. And the third source of universal beauty that Tarkovsky weaves throughout the film is nostalgia for childhood. There's a reason why we see the central character, Alexei, so often and so directly as a child, and why the film goes through such great lengths to obfuscate him and to hide him when he's an adult. the film really centers upon that unique sense of wonder and joy that children experience. And I and I hate to like crassly advertise my other work here, but I do have a video that dives more deeply into the question of wonder and what it means to experience childhood wonder. So you can check that out if you want to, and I'm not going to go too deep into that here, but suffice to say, any adult alive probably has these deep and intense and powerful and spiritual associations with the time that they were a child. And the film plays heavily and beautifully with those associations. And in fact, dreams about childhood are very central to the film. And the childhood sequences in the film are those in which it's hardest to discern memory from dream, and in which memory sequences blend seamlessly into dream sequences. And in fact, there's a monologue that the main character Alexei gives near the climax of the film about dreams that he has about being back at his grandparents' farm and the experience of being a child again through the lens of dream, and how powerful and how heartbreaking that is. And I know I, for one, was just absolutely devastated by that monologue because, ironically, I spent the first few years of my life living with my grandparents because my parents took my dad a little while to get a job and really get settled on his own. So for the first few years of my childhood, my parents were living with my grandparents. And those are some of the most beautiful and powerful memories that I have still, even to this day. That sense of a whole family being joined together under one roof, and that sense of being in my grandparents' house and having those sorts of experiences of childhood, of feeling like being fully integrated into a larger family. Those are profound experiences, and those are experiences that the film captures exquisitely. And those are experiences that I think, like the other ones that I've spoken about so far, are fairly universal, even though we don't all have the same childhood, and even though, you know, many people never meet their grandparents or estranged from their grandparents or one or both parents. I think a lot of people have this kind of sense of there being some time before the fall, of being a time before the loss of innocence, whatever that may be for them. And that experience of living in innocence and through innocence and having these kind of pure, uncontaminated experiences are something that I think most human beings can understand, and something that the film goes out of its way to present in a way that we can all understand and relate to. And finally, and I think this is maybe a little bit more speculative and a little bit more wild and out there, but I think the film is trying to present the possibility of there being a kind of universal shared memory and a kind of universal shared experience that transcends any given individual. And in fact, that transcends even humanity itself. So one of the first scenes in the movie features a conversation between two characters where one character presents to the other the possibility that plants might be sentient, that plants might actually have some understanding of what's going on, and that plants might in fact have a kind of wisdom that humans don't. There's this kind of intimation of the possibility of a sort of shared earthly consciousness, of these plants with these roots that are intertwined, that are sending cognitive signals to each other. And that, I think, can be sort of abstracted out to an idea of this kind of larger shared consciousness that transcends us. And personally, I don't think plants are sentient. Personally, I don't think grass and trees are thinking, but I think it's kind of a great metaphor, a kind of a great way to visualize and conceptualize this idea that maybe some part of our consciousness exists outside of ourselves and transcends ourselves. And in fact, that very same scene concludes with the first instance of that image I talked about before of the wind sweeping through the grass. So when we see the wind ripple through the grass and we watch that whole field move in unison, almost in a synchronized, almost in an intelligent and intentional way, that only underscores what the character had said earlier. That only adds an extra layer of significance to that conversation about the possibility of plant life being sentient on some level, and only serves to indicate and hint towards the possibility of some greater shared universal intelligence. And all of this comes together beautifully and wonderfully in the final scene of the movie. The final sequence of the film involves a couple of elements. One is this incredible long shot that's set really close to the ground with the camera aiming down, and the camera kind of pans over this stretch of earth. And what you see is not only grass and dirt and rocks and all of these natural things that you expect to see on the ground, but also these bits of human trash, these leftover pieces of detritus from human life and human civilization. And in fact, it pans over the foundation of a destroyed building that may very well be that barn that burned down earlier in the film. And you see within the foundation of that building, you know, dishes and pans and containers and all these things that humans leave behind, all these little bits and pieces of everyday human life, intermingled with grass, intermingled with plant life that's just growing up and that's just come to consume what was left of this human structure. And you get this really vivid image of human life and the life of the earth being completely and entirely intertwined, being basically one, being inseparable. And then, as part of the very same final sequence, we go through this stretch where we first see the central character's mother. We see Alexei's mother as a young woman with his father as a young man, and she's talking about being pregnant and whether he would want their first child to be a boy or a girl. And then within, once again, this same sequence, we see Alexei as a child with his sister and with his mother. But the mother we see him with is his mother as an old woman, the mother from the present day sequences as opposed to the past sequences. And so we have in this one uninterrupted sequence sort of the complete collapse of any distinction between the past and the present, between things dreamed and remembered, between the earth itself and the people that inhabit it. You have everything from the film being consumed and subsumed into this kind of one shared moment that demolishes all the divisions and the distinctions between them. And you have this one sort of beautiful shared moment of unity and of maybe finally true communication. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to end there. I have more I could say about the film. I could probably make 2 or 3 more videos just about the larger themes of the film, just about what makes it beautiful. But I've burned through 2 batteries and I'm on my second SD card, and this is going to be one hell of a pain to edit. So I think I'm going to end it there. That said, stay tuned for a second video about Mirror, where I really dig into a single scene from the film and really explore what makes that scene tick, what makes it work, what makes it wonderful. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And of course, thank you so much. If you're watching this, thank you for sticking through to the end. If you don't mind, if you could like and subscribe, those things really help me with the algorithm. And even better, if you want to leave a comment, that would be wonderful. I've gotten so many just really insightful comments on my past videos, and I try my best to read all of them. I respond to as many as I can. And it always gives me a new perspective on what I'm talking about. I mean, to hell with the algorithm. It's just fascinating to hear what other people have to say about these topics that I'm so into and so obsessed with. So yeah, that's it for real now. Thank you so much. I guess goodbye, good night, hell, whatever. Hey everyone, so this is my second video about Andrei Tarkovsky's masterpiece, Mirror, a beautiful and mysterious film about the nature of memory. In my first video, I spoke about the film in kind of broad, general terms. I dug into some of its themes, and I really wanted to get at what made it beautiful, what made it an exceptional piece of cinematic art. Now, in this video, I'm going to get a little bit more specific. I want to talk about a single scene from the film. I'm not going to spend too much time rehashing what I spoke about in my last video. So if you're not familiar with the film, or if you want a little bit of a refresher on some of its themes and ideas, or if you just want to hear what I said about the film and you missed my first video, I'm going to put a link in the description. You can go and watch that now if you would like. But, as I said, right now, I really want to dig into just one scene from the film. And you know, it's funny because this is a film full of absolutely beautiful and gorgeous scenes. This is a film full of just wonderfully captivating and mysterious and mystical imagery. This is a film that dives deep into Russian history, that really digs deeply into a single person's life and examines it from all of these different angles and through all of these different lenses. This is a film where some individual shots are framed in such a way as to mimic classical works of Russian art. And yet, the scene that left the most distinct first impression on me was a much simpler one. The image that I just could not shake after watching this film for the first time was of a ring of condensation left by a teacup slowly evaporating off of a tabletop. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like the most pretentious thing that perhaps any human being has ever said. You know, here's this film full of all these wonderful and inventive and captivating images. And yeah, you dude, you're fixated on a teacup. You're fixated on some water vapor evaporating. I can see why that might sound odd. I can see why that might sound pretentious. I can see how that might sound like something the most obnoxious art snob in the world would say. But, stick with me here. Stick with me here. We're going to dig into that scene. I'm going to give you some context. We're going to frame that scene, and hopefully, when I'm done talking about it, you'll walk away appreciating it as much as I do. So, first off, let me summarize the scene for you, because even though I framed it as being a scene about a teacup, there's actually a lot more to it than that. So, this scene is a little peculiar, because unlike most of the scenes in this film, it doesn't revolve around the film's protagonist, Alexei. Instead, it revolves almost entirely around his son, Ignat. So this moment in the film starts off with Ignat's mother preparing to leave him alone at Alexei's flat. So Alexei and his former wife are divorced, and Ignat had been living with his mother, but they had just had a discussion and decided that Ignat should stay with his father for a little while. Now, at this point, Alexei is not in the house. Ignat is being left home completely alone, and there's this sort of quick sense of separation anxiety. There's this moment where he's going to be left alone in his father's house for the first time. And as his mother is preparing to leave, she accidentally spills the contents of her purse all over the floor. And so Ignat comes over and starts to help his mother pick up the change and other items that she's dropped and put them back in her purse. And while he's helping his mother pick these items up from the floor, Ignat suddenly experiences a shock. It seems almost like a static electric charge. And when his mother notices him have this kind of jolt and asks him what's wrong, he describes an experience that we would basically recognize as deja vu, even though he doesn't use the term deja vu. He talks about feeling like he's been in this place before, doing this before, even though he has never been there before. And then his mother gets up and she leaves the apartment, and almost as soon as she's gone, he turns around and he sees a woman sitting at a table in a room behind him who was certainly not there a moment ago, who seems to materialize out of thin air. And this woman has not appeared previously in the film. She's not identifiable as any member of his family. She's not an aunt or a grandmother or anyone else that we, the audience anyway, would recognize. We have no way of knowing why she's in Alexei's flat and how she got there. And there's a servant in the room with this woman who also wasn't there a moment ago. And she asks the servant to get her a cup of tea. And then, after the servant leaves, without really introducing herself, without providing any context at all, she asks Ignat to reach into a bookshelf and remove a notebook. And she asks him to read an underlined portion in the notebook. And the underlined portion turns out to be a selection from one of Pushkin's letters. Pushkin being a very famous Russian author. And then, after Ignat finishes reading this excerpt of Pushkin's writing, without any other additional explanation, this woman tells him to go and answer the door. So he goes to the door of his father's apartment, opens it, and there's a woman standing in the hallway. An entirely different woman who we also haven't been introduced to before. This woman basically says, "Oh shoot, I have the wrong apartment." And then she leaves, and Ignat closes the door and turns around, and the mysterious woman who he'd been talking to before has just disappeared. But, the ring of condensation from her teacup is still present on the table that she was sitting at. And we slowly watch this ring of condensation evaporate while suddenly this really ominous, booming, very dark music cuts in. And we just watch as the water vapor on this table just slowly disappears. We watch this ring of condensation from the teacup on the tabletop completely evaporate. There's no cut here. This is a remarkably long take of just pure evaporation while this really, really insidious music plays in the background. And then suddenly the music cuts out. The table is empty again. There's no sign of at all of this woman. And the camera cuts back behind Ignat. And something remarkable has happened because the room that he's looking into, the room that he's standing in front of, this is a shot that's framed behind Ignat. So we're looking at him from the back while he is looking into this room. That room that he is looking into has entirely changed. It is in no way, shape, or form the room where he met the mysterious woman who has now completely vanished. And then, before we can really acclimate ourselves to what the hell just happened, the phone suddenly rings, and Ignat goes and answers the phone, and it's his father, Alexei, on the line, and then he has this conversation with his father. And just like that, we're jolted out of this very weird and very alien scene and back into something resembling the real world. So what the hell is going on with this scene? It's a weird scene. It's a weird scene. It's a scene that follows logic that is alien even by the standards of this film, which is often opaque and disorienting. So let's dig into it. If you're anything like me, you left this scene feeling deeply unsettled, feeling like something was profoundly, even spiritually wrong, feeling like you had just witnessed something maybe even scary, but you might not be able to say why. And certainly I wasn't able to say why the first time I watched the film through. And I think in order to understand where that visceral emotional response to this scene comes from, how a scene that culminates or climaxes in some water vapor evaporating off of a tabletop could be so unsettling, you have to look at how this scene reflects some of the larger themes of the film. Now, I talked about this a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit, in my last video, but one of the fundamental themes of Mirror is failed communication and how hard it is to communicate our memories and experiences to others, whether they're members of our own family or whether we're talking about some deeper communication between generations. And boy, there's a lot of failed communication happening in this scene. All kinds of different varieties of failed communications and all these weird little disunities between characters. So first of all, you have the big one. You have the glaring one. You have this ghostly seeming woman, this apparition, who, by the way, is dressed in a historical style, who is immediately recognizable as not being from the same time and place as Ignat. So that's the most obvious, immediate, and jarring disconnect in this scene. You have this woman who seems to be from a different time and place, who just appears out of nowhere, and who never really clearly communicates who she is, why she's there, and even what she wants from Ignat, besides making this really odd request that he read this very specific passage from this very specific book. But there are other more subtle moments in this scene that also underscore that failure to communicate, to see eye to eye, this sense of people being separated from each other by barriers that even perhaps they can't fully comprehend and understand. Another obvious one is the woman at the door. Not only does she serve as this sudden moment that breaks the flow of the scene up to that point, that breaks this weird shared moment between Ignat and this ghostly woman, but she also is at the wrong door. She is not where she's supposed to be. And so you have this really far more mundane exchange between her and Ignat than the exchange between him and the mysterious woman. But still a deeply awkward exchange rooted in miscommunication, rooted in confusion, rooted in a mistake, her being at the wrong door at the wrong time. So you have no communication there. You have another kind of misconnection moment. And then you have that letter from Pushkin that the woman asks Ignat to read. And this letter, I just glossed over it in my summary of the scene. I didn't really talk about what it was about. But the letter deals with the schism between the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And if you're not familiar with the Great Schism, basically long ago in the pre-medieval period, the Catholic Church, which up to that point had largely been one entity, and which had been relatively recently propped up by the Roman Empire, had this great division form. There was, I'm not going to like get into the nitty-gritty details here because I don't know most of them, but essentially the end result was that the Catholic Church split into what we today refer to as the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And Eastern Orthodoxy, I mean, it's right there in its name, right? Eastern Orthodoxy would end up being the sort of primary Christian religion of Asia and Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, while the Roman Catholic Church would cling to the remnants of the Roman Empire and was basically centered in Rome, as it's still centered in Rome, and would have, until the Protestant Reformation, kind of a stranglehold on most of Western Europe. And this letter from Pushkin that the woman has Ignat read is about how that schism, how the separation of this once unified church into two churches helped to shape the Russian character, and how it led to a kind of isolation of the Russian people who once again were in the Orthodox Church as opposed to the Catholic Church, and how that isolation, how that sense of being separated from the rest of Christendom came to shape and form Russian identity. And Pushkin goes on to kind of present the Russians as being this sort of uniquely isolated and separated people. And there's more to the letter than that, but that's sort of the rough gist of it. And I think you know what I'm going to say. This is a letter. This is a kind of academic musing on a deeper failed communication, a deeper sense of alienation and disconnection from the world, like a kind of universal Russian alienation. And so there's that theme again. And so even as Ignat seems to have no comprehension of why he's reading this thing and what the meaning of the letter is, we as the audience can start to see a hint of a deeper thematic connection there. And that theme of miscommunication even extends to the more mundane moments that bookend this scene or this sequence. So this scene opens and closes with conversations between Ignat and his parents. It opens, as I said, with a conversation between Ignat and his mother as she prepares to leave him, and it closes with this phone conversation between Ignat and Alexei, his father. And you know what? Both of these conversations are full of just miscommunication. Ignat's mother doesn't seem to understand that he's just had this moment that for him is profoundly weird in like the deja vu experience that he's had. She just kind of tells him to hurry up and not to be silly and kind of condescendingly sort of pushes him away and heads out the door. And meanwhile, in the phone call with his father that ends the scene, there's a sort of similar dynamic at play where Alexei asks Ignat, like, if he has a crush on any girls, if he's had any girlfriends. And Ignat kind of answers with incomprehension. Like, you can tell that he hasn't arrived at the point in his life where he's thinking in romantic terms. But Alexei follows that up by saying, "Oh, well, by the time I was your age, I had already had several crushes. I had fallen in love several times." And then he goes off on this personal story about this girl that he had a crush on when he was young. And that kind of segues into the next scene and into the next sequence. So even here, in what seems superficially like a moment of bonding between a father and son, there's still this massive chasm of difference of experience that separates these two characters. They just can't connect, even on this basic, very simple human level. So again and again and again, in this sequence, in this relatively short sequence, we're given moment after moment after moment where characters just cannot connect with each other. And what's more, the connective tissue between these moments themselves seems to be frayed in some way. So setting aside the way in which any individual subsection of this sequence involves miscommunication or failed communication, the connective tissue between these scenes feels frayed, it feels missing, it feels broken in some way. It feels like even these subsequences within these larger sequences are failing to communicate with each other. Like, there's not a clear logical connection. Why does the ghostly woman tell Ignat to open the door? Why is the woman at the door? Why does the ghostly woman materialize at all? Why does she show up as soon as the mother leaves? Why does she disappear after the woman answers the door? Why does she leave the ring of condensation behind? Why does the room itself change as soon as the ring of condensation evaporates? Why does the phone ring when it does? Like, the internal logic of this scene seems fundamentally at odds with itself. Like I said, even the apartment itself, even the set, does not remain a static and concrete place during this scene. That room changes. And not only does that room change, but the entire apartment seems to have changed when Alexei walks to the phone to answer it. Now, it's possible that we're just seeing the apartment from the reverse angle, so we're seeing the kind of hallway that's at the center of the shot from the opposite end, like the camera is pointing in the opposite direction now. That's totally possible, but from the audience's perspective, it seems as if even the entire concrete physical world around Ignat has at the very least rotated, if not changed entirely and magically in this moment. It's almost like a continuity error, except it's definitely not. It's almost like an intentional continuity error. It's almost as if the film has forgotten something fundamental about itself. It's almost as if the film is failing to communicate with itself. You know, as if there was some kind of mix-up behind the scenes and camera operators changed between shots and somebody didn't tell someone else how this shot should be framed, how this room should be laid out, and so on and so forth. It's really fascinating. Like, it operates at almost a meta level. It's almost a meta level of miscommunication in this film about miscommunication, in this film about memory, and about the way that memory changes over time. It's almost as if the memory of this shot itself has been altered mid-scene. It's almost as if it's testing the memory of the audience, or as if the audience are being urged to wonder if they've misremembered something about this set, about this apartment, about this shot, this scene, this sequence. Ah, it's so good. It's so good. But, like the film itself, this sequence isn't willing to just surrender and give up and leave us with the idea that, oh, all communication is impossible, all memory is faulty, there's nothing deeper operating beneath or behind all of this. No, because there are a couple of crucial details to this sequence that, once again, just like the larger film, hint at the possibility for some deeper, maybe spiritual understanding, hint at the possibility that there are cycles at work here, that the past may, in some ways, be in communication with the present, that maybe there is something deeper and more profound here, that not everything is pure schizophrenia, pure confusion. And one of the real hints at that in this scene is that fleeting moment of deja vu that Ignat has. Because what is deja vu? I know, like a cognitive psychologist would tell you that deja vu is just basically a processing error in the brain. It's just a cognitive hiccup, right? It's just your brain processing the present as a memory instead of processing it as an experience that's happening right now. But this isn't a scientific film. This isn't a film about neurobiology. This is a film about experiences, about like the way we feel, the way things feel to us. Because that's the level at which art functions. Art functions on the level of feeling. And so how does deja vu feel to the person while they're experiencing it? Well, deja vu feels like this odd sense of connection with a time outside of the time that you're experiencing yourself in the moment. Deja vu feels kind of like a spiritual hint at some deeper cycles happening in time and in reality and in history. Like it presents a possibility that maybe history does rhyme, maybe it does repeat itself, and that maybe we can tap in to that sense of shared memory or that sense of shared experience. Or maybe we can experience a memory that isn't even our own in some way, if that makes sense, right? That maybe we can, for a moment, connect either with our own past or with someone else's past or with someone else's experience. Like, deja vu has this kind of weird spiritual resonance to it. And I think within this scene, that's exactly how it's being used by Tarkovsky. I think Tarkovsky presents it here at the beginning of the scene, right before Ignat encounters this ghostly apparition of a woman, to hint at the fact that something about time, something about history is about to collapse, that we're about to like walk through a gate or a passage that leads to another historical moment, or that there's going to be a kind of collapse, might be a better way to put it, of two historical moments. A moment of weird connection between this woman from another time and Ignat, who is from the present, or at least the film's present, and that even if they can't quite speak directly to each other, even if they can't quite really share something fully understood with each other, there can still be that moment of connection. There's still some kind of shared humanity there. And I think the excerpt from Pushkin's letter also gets at that, because Pushkin doesn't simply say, well, the Great Schism happened and the Russian Orthodox Church was alienated from Christianity, from the rest of Christianity, for all of time. No, he actually proposes the idea that the schism may have saved Christianity as a religion and as an institution. He suggests in the letter that because Russia was this vast landmass with its own form of Christianity, it in some ways swallowed up the Mongol invasion, which Pushkin conceives of as this kind of pagan invasion, this kind of threat to the institution of Christianity itself. And he sort of offers that because the schism occurred, Catholicism, Catholic Christianity, was able to be insulated and protected from the Mongols when they arrived, and that Russia kind of swallowed that invasion up and dealt with it, and that it didn't leave this larger stain on all of European Christianity. And it's a weird hypothesis. It's I'm not sure if it's a historical hypothesis that I 100% buy into, but within the context of the film, it's really interesting because it hints at the possibility of some kind of greater historic purpose and some kind of greater destiny, even, and a way in which maybe this historical event that seemed to isolate and alienate Russia from the rest of the European world may have also protected Europe's culture or identity or religion in some sense too. And so you have this larger sense of maybe there being some purpose, some rhythm, some sense to history. And another really interesting thing here is that as Ignat reads this letter, even though he clearly doesn't comprehend what he's reading, like he stumbles over it, he actually starts to read the wrong part of the notebook at first, and then he finally finds what he's supposed to read, and he doesn't seem to understand it. But as he's reading, the camera pans over to the face of the spectral woman, and as he reads, you get this real sense, that she's suddenly filled with deep emotion. Like you can see this kind of profound sadness or feeling come over her face. You get this sense that this letter means something of great importance to her, even if it means almost nothing to Ignat, and that he is, even if he's not understanding it, he is communicating something to her. He's providing her with some sense of meaning, even as the audience watches on with some confusion. Okay, but what about that ring of condensation? Because that's what we started with, right? And that is in a real way the climax of this sequence. Everything that happens before and after this sequence kind of exists around this great well of thematic gravity that's provided by the evaporation of this single little ring of condensation left by this teacup. So why? So why is that the center of this scene? Why is that the climax of this entire sequence? Especially given how wild the things that happen around it are. Well, personally, I think that this very simple, very direct image pulls together a lot of the themes and the emotion and the significance, not only of this scene, but of the entire film in a very profound and very beautiful way. So first of all, what is unique about condensation? Well, it's simultaneously tangible and intangible. You have the kind of perfect image of a thing that exists in the state of ceasing to exist, that is as fleeting and intangible as a thing can be while still being real. And wow, like that's everything in this scene, right? So much of this sequence is about these singular moments that feel real and unreal at the same time, real and surreal at the same time. You have the mystery woman, of course, who cannot possibly be in that apartment, and yet she is in that apartment. You have the woman at the door who shows up for no clear purpose and leaves without explaining herself. You have the way that the apartment is always, on the one hand, this solid and concrete environment that Ignat occupies, and yet seems to change form around him. So that tangibility and intangibility, that sense of something being real, but being impossible to really get your hands around, something that is just going to evaporate and disappear as soon as you try to grasp it. Really, that whole sense is running through this entire scene. That whole feeling, that vibe runs through this whole sequence. But it's not simply the sense of something being real and not real at the same time, because once again, going way back to the beginning of this video, it's not simply that we watch this ring of condensation evaporate before our eyes, but this tremendous, ominous music plays at the same time. So this isn't simply supposed to be an ephemeral experience, a kind of emotionally neutral or wistful experience, an experience of questioning what's real and what isn't. This is supposed to be, on some level, a scary and disconcerting experience. And why? Why? Well, I mean, I've been kind of tiptoeing around it this whole video, but this scene is really a kind of mini ghost story. And it's funny because the entire time the woman is with us, this spectral apparition, or this woman who seems to have come from a different time, maybe this ghost of a woman, is in this scene with us. The Tarkovsky treats it in a very kind of emotionally neutral way. We don't get a lot of hints about how we should be feeling about this encounter. We just feel kind of weird. We're caught off guard, but we're not being given a lot of emotional cues. It's only after she's gone and we see the ring of condensation that's left behind by her teacup that suddenly the emotional, spooky, well, maybe not spooky, but at least unnerving music kicks in. And why? Why? Like, what is it that's so scary about water vapor? First of all, this is the moment that Ignat is actually processing what he just experienced. The fact that he just seemingly had an experience with the supernatural, or at least an experience that he can't explain and process. And so while we're watching that water vapor evaporate, we're also processing this thing we've seen that doesn't make sense to us. But also there's this wonderful duality to that condensation, to that water vapor. Not only the reality, unreality thing I was talking about, but also in terms of what it says about this woman, this apparition that Ignat just saw. Because, yes, on the one hand, like, she has just evaporated, she has just vanished like the condensation from her teacup. And so we get a sense of how intangible she was, how out of place and out of time and out of material understanding this experience was. But also at the same time, the fact that the ring of condensation remains after she has left confirms her reality. It's a physical sign that she was really physically in this room, that she wasn't simply a ghost in the classical sense, right? That she wasn't just some immaterial specter that walked through the wall and was just kind of there while not being there. She was physically in this room. If she wasn't physically in this room, she could not have left that ring from her teacup behind. Her teacup would have been immaterial like her. It would have been fake like her. It wouldn't have produced heat. It wouldn't have left heat and water on that tabletop. There would be nothing for us to watch slowly evaporate. So it's this incredibly uncanny and unnerving experience where simultaneously you're processing the fact that you could not just have had the experience you just had. You could not have just seen this thing that you just saw. It couldn't possibly have been real. But at the same time, it definitely was, because here's physical proof of its existence. But I think there's an additionally unnerving existential angle to this, because this scene in some ways is potentially Ignat's first moment of reckoning with his own mortality, with the fact that he will die someday. And I don't know about you, but I had a moment as a child, as well as 11, 12 years old, when I was lying in bed, and for the first time, like, it suddenly clicked, oh, shit. Someday I am going to die, and all of this will be gone. And I think that's a fairly common experience that children, young adults, that everyone has at one point in their life, where they are suddenly forced to reckon with just how brief and ephemeral their lives are, and with the question of whether life has real, lasting, permanent substance. And I think that's a big reason why we're seeing this scene through Ignat's perspective and not through Alexei's perspective. I think it's important for us to have this experience through the eyes of a child. There's actually a comparable scene in Ingmar Bergman's miniseries Fanny and Alexander, where we see this young kid and he's just kind of in his house. He's just kind of playing make-believe. I don't remember the exact details of the scene off the top of my head, but he's just kind of in the parlor of his house and he's just kind of playing around. And we're watching this moment of childhood joy and we're seeing this moment through the eyes of this young character. And then suddenly he looks over and out of the corner of his eyes, he sees and we see the Grim Reaper or a specter of death just standing there. And it's this shocking moment. It's this incredibly unnerving moment where this sense of real childhood innocence and playfulness is just shattered by this brief image of death. And I think something very similar is happening in this scene where you have a child who hasn't really fully reckoned with his mortality yet. And then he has this experience where he comes face to face with this woman who may very well be dead, who may very well be a ghost, and who suddenly forces him to consider not only the brevity of his own life, but she confronts him with the history of his country. The whole thing is unnerving and disorienting. She's there and she's fucking gone, completely gone. And only this ring of condensation is left behind. And so while we watch this thing evaporate, this ring of vapor and heat that both has substance and doesn't have substance, that is there, but is only there and only real for one brief, fleeting moment. And as that dark, ominous music swells, we're almost forced to think about mortality. We're almost forced to consider death. And we're almost forced to consider the fact that life is so much like that, that life is not as permanent and tangible as we'd like it to be, that it is over so much more quickly than we'd like to believe it is, that our moment in time is just that. Our life is momentary, and then it's gone, and it's absorbed up and out into this larger sphere of history and whatever reality exists above and beyond and outside ourselves. And yeah, so it's a scary scene, fundamentally. It's a pretty scary scene, and also a profound and moving one. And also one, though, that does have just that little hint of optimism, just that little bit of hope that maybe, even though our lives are brief and largely intangible and really frickin' hard to understand, that maybe there is something real and concrete beyond just our simple insular little existences, our simple short little lives. And maybe we are connected to something greater in some way. Maybe we're a part of some greater narrative that we can't understand. All right, that's it. That's it. I want to apologize, first of all, here at the end. I know it's been a while between videos. I've had kind of a tumultuous month. A relative got sick and was hospitalized. I got sick, not nearly to the degree that I would have to be hospitalized. I just got a stomach flu that kind of laid me up in bed for a few days. And I've been dealing with a little bit of depression and yada, yada, yada. I don't want to go on and on about my personal life, but the point is, this video took way longer to make than I anticipated, than I planned. So I really apologize. I am going to try very hard to get on a semi-regular upload schedule from here on out, trying to do once a week, once every 2 weeks. I don't want you to be waiting a month or more between videos. So I'm very sorry for that. And I thank you very much for being patient with me. And I also want to thank everyone who watched this video. Thank everyone who stuck around to listen to me rant and ramble. If you don't mind, I would really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, if you could like, if you could subscribe, if you could hit that bell notification icon. I've never asked anyone to do that before, but I did have a couple of people comment that they didn't get my most recent videos, that my most recent videos didn't show up in their feed. So if you want to make sure you see my videos in the future, just hit that notification icon. And yeah, thank you so much. Also, I appreciate all the comments, all the nice things that have been said about my previous videos. I am very much still in the process of figuring out what the hell I'm doing. So all the kind words are really appreciated. They keep me going. Anyway, that's it. I've rambled too long. This video is going to be a nightmare to edit. Thank you so much. Okay, bye. Hey everyone. So, Halloween is coming up, and I thought that it would be a good idea to do a video diving into a horror film. But there's a little problem, which is I'm just not a big fan of the horror genre. Now, I don't think it's a quality thing. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with horror films of any variety, but I just often feel personally that I just can't connect with them. Or worse, I often feel kind of like turned off by them on a visceral level. I think what it comes down to is basically I'm a coward. Basically, I'm not a person who enjoys being scared. And I'm particularly not a person who likes jump scares or plots that are mostly contingent on trying to figure out which character will be viciously slaughtered first, or kind of spending all of your time just hoping and praying that your favorite character doesn't take an axe in the back. That's just not really the kind of cinematic experience that I enjoy. But even with my irrational prejudice against the genre, there's actually one horror film that I consider among not only the greatest films ever made, but among the most beautiful films ever made. And that's Masaki Kobayashi's 1964 film, Kwaidan. And I'm going to apologize up front here because I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably going to pronounce it Kwaidan throughout the course of this video. But frankly, before recording, I tried to look up the correct pronunciation and found multiple conflicting videos and multiple conflicting reports. In fact, I watched a video where Guillermo del Toro was talking about his love of the film, and he managed to pronounce the title two different ways over the course of like 35 seconds.
Well, Kwaidan by Masaki Kobayashi is a crucial film. The stories are based on a book of his called Kwaidan. Kwaidan.
So I'm going to call it Kwaidan if you're a native Japanese speaker or just somebody who is a little bit more proficient in film history than I am, and I am butchering the name. I apologize. I'm sorry, but we all have to live with our limitations. We all have to do the best within our limited knowledge and ability, I guess. Anyway, let's talk about Kwaidan. So Kwaidan is a horror anthology film, which alone kind of sets it apart since it was made in 1964 before the horror anthology became a kind of midnight movie staple. So the film doesn't just consist of a single narrative. Instead, it's made up of 4 separate segments, and each of these segments is an adaptation of a different Japanese ghost story. The film's first segment is called The Black Hair, and it tells the story of a poor samurai who abandons his wife and leaves his home in order to remarry into a wealthy family and to work under a wealthier master. Eventually, he just becomes completely consumed by guilt and haunted by the memory of this wife who he left behind. And his new marriage doesn't go well because he's so cold and distant and fixated on the past. And without spoiling too much, he eventually becomes so consumed by regret that he abandons his new wife and returns to the ruins of his old home to try to reconcile with the woman that he abandoned, the woman that he left behind. And yeah, it doesn't exactly go to plan. The second segment in the anthology is called The Woman of the Snow, and it tells the story of a young woodcutter who gets stranded with his older master in a blizzard and ends up having to camp out in this tiny little shack in the woods. In the middle of the night, he wakes up to see this ghostly looking woman dressed entirely in white with pale skin standing over his master, breathing on him this cold breath that just seems to suck and steal the life directly from him. And then the woman turns to him, and she's about to do the same thing to him, but she pauses, and she decides to take pity on him and allow him to live. But she forces him to promise that he will never tell the story of his encounter to anyone ever again. And she says if he ever breaks his promise, she will return and take his life. And it's at this point that the story takes kind of an unexpected twist, because after he returns home and recuperates, the woman actually returns to him in the form of a young traveler. And she essentially seduces him and convinces him to marry her without ever revealing to him her true identity, even though we, as the audience, can intuit it fairly easily. And the second half of this vignette is actually dedicated in some ways to exploring their relationship together, their life together as a married couple, and where that goes. Now, the third vignette is called Hoichi the Earless, and it follows its titular character, Hoichi, who is a blind monk who has just joined a new monastery by the seashore. And Hoichi just happens to be an incredibly talented musician and storyteller. And also, perhaps purely by coincidence, this monastery that he's recently joined is very near to the site of an ancient naval battle from hundreds of years before, where one historic Japanese clan annihilated another in the midst of a particularly bloody conflict. And so Hoichi is unknowingly approached by the ghost of one of the warriors who was killed in this battle, and lured away from the monastery and convinced to perform a ballad depicting the events of that great historic battle to the ghosts of all of the warriors and royalty who were killed in the battle. And these specters of fallen soldiers and nobility love his version of the ballad so much that night after night they come back and they drag him away again and convince him to go again and again and again to perform this ballad for them. And so as Hoichi falls more and more under the spell of these ghosts, the other monks in the monastery realize that something is up and try to concoct a plan to free Hoichi from these otherworldly influences. And the final vignette in the anthology is called In a Cup of Tea. And this is an interesting one. This is one that is, in terms of plot and in terms of style, very different from the other three. So this story is framed explicitly as an unfinished tale. So we're told right at the beginning of this vignette that it's not going to have a satisfying conclusion, that it's not going to be all wrapped up for us. And instead, we get a very bizarre story about a samurai who pours himself a glass of tea and sees the reflection of another man in that glass of tea, a man who is nowhere to be seen in the real world, in the world surrounding him. Here's a man entirely alone who pours himself a cup of tea and sees a totally different human being's reflection in it. And so he throws out that cup of tea and pours himself another one. And sure enough, this man's reflection is back in the second cup of tea. And he throws that cup of tea away and pours a third one. And once again, there's the man's reflection. There's the man staring back at him from within the tea in the teacup. And so ultimately, this guy is like the hell with it, and he drinks the cup of tea. And as a result, he may or may not have consumed the soul of this ghostly man in the process. And then the entire story spirals out from there. The entire story is an exploration of the consequences of that decision. And once again, without spoiling too much, that story ends in a very modern and very meta way that's also deeply frightening, I think. Okay, so now that I've given you a brief overview of the film, we can finally ask the question, what is it that makes it such a beautiful work of cinematic art? And, well, first of all, just on a very superficial level, this is an absolutely gorgeous movie to look at. This film is visually stunning. It's funny because we don't usually think of horror films as being beautiful. At least I know I don't. And when we do talk about beauty in horror, we're often talking about a kind of grotesque beauty. You know, the beauty of the macabre. Or something like, as I mentioned at the top, maybe something like Guillermo del Toro, where many of the things he creates in his films, the creatures and the settings, are beautiful insofar as they're ghastly, memorable more for just how viscerally terrifying they are and unnerving they are than for how beautiful they are in any conventional sense. But that's not really the kind of beauty that I'm talking about here. This isn't a film that is so ugly in such a unique way that it passes beyond the realms of ugliness, that it transcends ugliness and becomes a work of beauty. No, this is a visually appealing, gorgeous film on its surface. And a big part of that is Kobayashi's use of color. And that's also kind of a weird compliment to give a horror film. You don't hear about many horror films being praised for their use of color. In fact, often films that are trying to be scary will intentionally dial back their palette, will intentionally stick to either black and white and gray, or to kind of washed out colors, you know, like pale green or kind of swampy, muddy colors. And there's a reason for that. There's a whole host of reasons for that. I mean, obviously, we on a visceral level, on a primordial level, human beings are scared of the dark. We have a natural and innate fear of what we cannot see. And many horror films use that fear to great effect. And so keeping the ghost or the monster or the demon or the serial killer out of sight, keeping them in shots that are dimly lit, that are mostly full of darkness, is just like intrinsically effective at making them scarier, at enhancing the audience's fear. And likewise, washed out, muddy colors are often intrinsically linked to ideas that we have about disease or corruption or contamination. You know, the colors of infection and gangrene and spoiled meat and human waste. These are all things that we have inherent knee-jerk biological fear reactions to, too, for good reason, because nobody wants to eat contaminated or spoiled food. You know, nobody wants to have an infected digit or limb. These are things that in the natural world mean sickness or death, or at least a dramatic decrease in your quality of life. But Kwaidan does not use that color palette at all. Kwaidan is not a film full of muddy browns and sickly greens. And it's not even a film that's too consumed by darkness. Although the color black does play a pretty critical role, especially in the first segment. I mean, it's even in the title of the first vignette. But black is only one of a very wide range of vivid colors that Kobayashi uses in this film. You have shots that feature just brilliant, bright, flaming red backdrops. You have pinks, you have greens, you have blues, you have white, especially in The Woman of the Snow. White in that segment is in some ways a more terrifying color than black. And terrifying is right, because even though this is a film that's full of bright, vivid colors, those colors don't detract from its power as a horror film. In fact, those colors in many ways enhance its ability to unnerve and frighten the viewer. And this is accomplished in no small part through Kobayashi's use of theatrical painted backdrops instead of more organic backgrounds and more organic skies. And just to clarify what I mean by this is a phenomenon that you actually see in a lot of older films. If you look closely, you'll notice that classic films, especially films from the 30s and 40s, have a tendency to use painted backdrops like theatrical sets rather than taking a camera outside and filming in an open, natural location, in a real location. So instead of seeing actual real skies, you'll see painted skies. Instead of having an actual cityscape in the background, there'll be a painted cityscape. There'll be a background that's very clearly a large canvas set up in the back of the shot. But anyway, Kwaidan is filled with these painted backdrops. And in fact, often there's no attempt to make them look like they're actual, natural, real-world skies or real-world locations. There's no real attempt to make them look authentic and real. Instead, Kobayashi really leans into making these backdrops look as otherworldly and supernatural as possible. One of the greatest examples of this is in the beginning of The Woman of the Snow, during the blizzard scene. The sky during that blizzard, the way it changes colors, the way that it looks like no earthly sky, no sky you would encounter in the real earthly world, not even in the midst of a cataclysmic snowstorm. It's just immediately jarring, and it immediately lets the audience know that something otherworldly, something supernatural is taking place. And in fact, as that sequence goes on, you begin to see eyes in those painted backdrops. You begin to see eyes painted into the sky. And those eyes actually become a reoccurring motif throughout that section. And they're greatly associated with the woman herself, the ghostly woman who materializes out of the blizzard, who has this kind of supernatural power to freeze men with her breath. And in fact, the film seems to use these backdrops to indicate that characters, and indeed maybe the audience themselves, have passed out of this world, this material world that we know, and into the spirit world. Because the film especially loves to use its most extreme painted backdrops in sequences where characters are in contact with that spirit world, in contact with either another reality or in contact with spirits and beings that have come from that other reality. In fact, the use of these backdrops is somewhat subdued in the first vignette in the series within the black hair. It does occur in a few instances, but the colors used in these backdrops are often more subdued during that segment, and the scenes depicted are somewhat more realistic. So it's easier to miss the fact that the film is using these artificial backgrounds within that first segment. And it's fitting because there's not much supernatural going on for the first 3/4 or so of the black hair. This is a more mundane story, at least at its start. It's not a creepy ghost story right from the drop, and the use of backgrounds and the use of color reflects that. But then in the second section, in The Woman of the Snow, in the section where the supernatural entity appears from minute one, or almost from minute one, and persists to have a dramatic presence throughout the entirety of the story, we see these backdrops in their most extreme form from the very first shot, from the very beginning of this vignette. And they persist throughout. And in fact, in the moments of real intimacy between this young lumberjack and this woman who he's fallen in love with, who he doesn't know is the ghostly entity who he encountered in the middle of that blizzard, the sky constantly gives away what's going on. In fact, even after he's left the blizzard itself and the physical and spiritual threat to his well-being that it represents, the skies are still super duper weird. And these skies are so weird because the ghost, or the supernatural entity, has never actually left the story. She's still there as his lover and his companion. And even as he's absorbed in his romantic feelings for her, we as the audience can see the sky and we can see that something unnatural is going on. And in fact, there's a great moment during the romantic montage of these two characters bonding, where we as the audience can very clearly see one of those big, scary eyes in the sky from the beginning, from the blizzard, materialize in a spot where the woodcutter cannot see, within our protagonist's blind spot, really. And it's this chilling moment, and it's wonderful because this is superficially this deeply romantic scene, but there's this fucking eye right there, and we are creeped out while we watch this. It doesn't feel right. Regardless of the puppy love scenario playing out on screen, we can see that the darkness and maybe the evil, or at least the otherworldly elements, are still present, and that this poor guy is still facing a supernatural threat that he doesn't even recognize. And then in Hoichi, the use of these backdrops is maybe even more significant and maybe even more dramatic. Actually, at the beginning of the story, we're presented with a dramatic and lengthy battle sequence where we watch this historical conflict play out. And this battle scene really drops all pretense that it's taking place in anything resembling our real world. For one thing, the backdrops return, and the skies in the sequence are just absolutely bright red. And even beyond that, this is superficially a battle that's taking place on open water, out in the ocean. But it's very clearly not actually filmed on the ocean. It's presented almost as if we're watching a film version of a stage play. There's all this artificial mist, artificial smoke rising up off the water, and we get no sense of the depth or scale of this water. We don't get the sense of an open ocean or an open sea. Instead, it actually feels fairly claustrophobic. You very much get the sense of this taking place within a false and artificial and staged, and like I said before, theatrical setting. And the costuming and performances too are very theatrical, very almost kabuki in their presentation. And not only that, but these battle reenactments are intercut with pictures of artwork, pictures of historical traditional Japanese art depicting this same battle. And so all of these artificial touches work together to give the sense not of us watching an actual battle that took place in some historical moment, but instead it feels more like we're watching Hoichi's ballad, his story, his retelling of this battle from within the theater of our own imagination. This feels like a scene that's very much intended to depict not the world as it was, but the world as we imagine it, as we're being told a tall tale or a ghost story. And obviously that perfectly overlaps with what's going on thematically, where we're being presented with a story about a storyteller. And even though this section is very clearly false on some level, it's also absolutely fucking gorgeous. It is a vivid and beautifully costumed and choreographed and shot sequence. And yeah, that same use of color, those same use of backdrops reoccur throughout Hoichi's story, especially when he's in the presence of the spirits, especially when he's in the presence of the ghosts. But this segment does something interesting because it also includes several scenes that are shot on the actual seashore, that are shot on the beach, on a real beach. There's a funeral scene where an individual who has allegedly been lured out into the ocean and drowned by the ghosts is buried at sea. And this is a real burial at sea. I mean, they're not actually burying a real human being at sea, but it's a real raft being set adrift on a real ocean, into a real sea. And there's another sequence where Hoichi is standing on some cliffs overlooking what's very clearly the actual honest-to-goodness ocean. And so you have the incorporation of real settings, real world locations within this story that has all of these obviously fanciful and fantastical locales and sets. And you might wonder, well, why is Kobayashi doing this? Like, why has he made this stylistic choice? And I think one reason for it is it heightens the contrast between the mundane, real world that these characters live in, and once again, as I said before, the spiritual, otherworldly reality occupied by these phantoms and these ghosts. And having that contrast there, having these glimpses of a real world, make us feel more intensely the weirdness and the horror of these other less real feeling, more unnatural and supernatural settings. And so this contrast becomes a way to inject some horror into this horror movie. And it injects this horror on an almost subconscious level. Because even if we're not consciously going from scene to scene saying, oh, okay, this scene was definitely shot on location out in the real world, and this scene was obviously shot on a set with a fake backdrop, our brain is subconsciously registering that something is off here. Because we get that these two realities don't fit cleanly together. We're willing to accept a film that feels 100% fake. We're willing to suspend disbelief if we're watching a movie and from the first scene it's obvious that everything was shot, on a set on a backlot somewhere. And likewise, we're willing to accept the idea of a quasi-documentary film where everything's shot on location. But when we start to see different styles interacting with each other and clashing with each other, that creates cognitive dissonance. That creates a sense of uneasiness deep within us. And this film, and especially this section of the film, plays beautifully with that unease. And the final vignette, In a Cup of Tea, does something really weird. And it's something that I actually found kind of off-putting the first time that I watched this film. And this was initially maybe my least favorite of the 4 segments because of this. And the thing I'm dancing around is it removes the painted backdrops either entirely or almost entirely. And it dials the color palette for the most part, way back and way down. And you get a sequence that's much more gray, much more pale, and much more reserved in its use of color, in the elaborateness and intricacy of its sets, in its costuming in many ways, except for one critical scene late in the sequence where you actually do get a trio of characters who are dressed in very colorful outfits. But yeah, there's this overwhelming sense that the color has been sucked out of this film, that some of the romantic excess of this film has been drained away in this final sequence. And so since what initially struck me so much about this film was its visual beauty, I watched In a Cup of Tea and I said, oh, I wish there was more going on here visually. But I actually think this is an intentional and very effective stylistic choice. Now, I have to be very careful here, and in fact, I'm going to issue a very mild spoiler warning for the end of the film. If you haven't watched this film yet, go watch it. It's an absolute masterpiece. It's better than some dude's YouTube video. So, anyway, the film ends on a very meta note. The last big scare of the film plays very heavily with the idea that you have just been watching a series of ghost stories in every sense of the word, that you've been watching a film about storytelling. So the final scare of the film deals with the rupturing of the barrier between the storyteller and the story that's being told, between the reality of the film and the reality of these stories, these narratives, and the reality that exists outside of these stories, and maybe even outside the film itself. And so, with that in mind, I think an intentional stylistic choice was made here. I think Kobayashi chose to keep this segment more subdued in its color palette, more subdued in its costuming, more subdued in its sets and presentation, exactly so that the audience would feel like they're being lured back into the real world, lured back into the mundane world that they inhabit, and out of that ghostly spirit world that kept popping up throughout the other segments of the film. And once we're lured into believing that, oh, this is something that more closely resembles reality, the distance between us as a viewer and the reality presented in the film becomes less and less. We start to feel on some level like, oh, okay, now we're back in the real world. Now maybe we're back in the space where these ghosts and these spirits and these phantoms can't touch us. And then, of course, at the end of the film, that world finds a way to touch ours. And we're left with this palpable sense of terror. And I do think terror because I do feel like the final scare of the film, without giving it away, was one of the scariest ones for me. But we're left with this palpable sense of terror because we no longer feel like there's this safe distance between the scary world of the film that we were watching and the safe world, the safe, mundane, simple, real, concrete world that we all occupy. And so, yeah, it freaks us out. Okay, so by now you probably get the fact that I think that this is a visually beautiful film. But you know what? I think it's also a thematically and emotionally beautiful film as well. This is a horror movie that manages to have real depth to the way it explores human lives and human minds and human emotions, and depth that goes beyond just the scares it provides. But it's still a really scary movie. I don't want to downplay or underplay that. At the end of the day, this is a deeply unsettling and legitimately horrifying film to watch. It's more the way that the film comes by its scares that's unique. The way the film frightens us, the way it disturbs us, the way it makes us feel uncomfortable, ill at ease, the way it makes us tense, the techniques it uses to make us legitimately horrified are, I think, rather different than those used by a lot of horror films. For one thing, this is a movie with almost no jump scares. There are a total of 2 moments in this film that could be considered jump scares in the traditional sense, where the camera suddenly cuts to a scary sight or something shocking that we weren't expecting. And in both of those instances, those jump scares are not really preceded by the kind of rapid, aggressive, and arguably manipulative editing that you often see in horror films. You know, the like, she's right behind you kind of shots. Instead, both of these shots, even though I think they are arguably jump scares, are heavily foreshadowed. And there's a lot of cold and meticulous build up to them. And both feel entirely natural and entirely earned. But more than that, I'm only talking about 2 scenes in a 3-hour movie here. 2 shots in a movie that is over 3 hours long. In a movie that has 4 different complete stories. So how does a film that has only 2 jump scares in its entire runtime manage to remain consistently unnerving, consistently scary, consistently terrifying throughout? Well, it does it by actually grappling with and actually addressing the things that truly frighten us on a deep psychological and human level. Things like guilt and death and loss and regret and, yes, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the prospect of coming into contact with something supernatural or otherworldly, something that we can't comprehend, can't understand, can't even perhaps process. And each of the different segments actually has a very different approach to eliciting fear and discomfort from the viewer. The black hair, for example, actually takes quite a long time before even arriving at its ghost, before arriving at anything supernatural. As I said before, the first 2/3 of this vignette is really just about this samurai becoming increasingly consumed with guilt, increasingly consumed with regret. And because it's willing to take the time to explore his feelings, because it's willing to force us to sit with a real human being while they grapple with the consequences of a choice that they made, a choice with real moral ramifications, with real human ramifications, we get sucked into his perspective and we start to feel that guilt. We start to feel the anguish that he feels over the choice that he made, and we start to long for the same kind of reconciliation that he's longing for. And that's important because the supernatural payoff at the end of this story, which I won't spoil in this video anyway, would not have the same impact if we hadn't really begun to feel his longing and really begun to hope for a moment of real reconciliation. If we didn't share his desire for a second chance, for an opportunity to set right the mistakes of the past, the ending of this vignette just wouldn't work in the same way for us. It just would not be as effective. And in fact, it's the way that this story toys with that emotion that we all share, that desire that we all share to be able to right mistakes that we've made in the past, that fantasy we all have about going back and undoing our mistakes, going back to the past and righting wrongs and correcting things and putting ourselves back on the right path. If we didn't all share that same universal longing, this story wouldn't work. But we do all share that same universal longing. We do all secretly yearn for that. And because that's something that we all secretly want and we all secretly wish we could do, the payoff of this story is unsettling for us, has deep emotional power, has deep, dark emotional power, because we're watching that desire of our hearts be frustrated, be subverted, be turned inside out and upside down as well. And so, like all great myth, like all great folklore, like all great ghost stories, this connects to our real lived psychological experience in a profound way. I don't want to spoil, even on an emotional level, all of these different stories. I do want you to sit down and watch the film if you haven't already. But out of all 4 segments, I think my favorite is The Woman of the Snow. And what I love about this story on an emotional level, on a thematic level, is how throughout it tantalizes you with exactly the threat that you expect from a ghost story, i.e., eventually this man is going to reveal his secret to the world, and this ghost woman is going to murder him, right? That's kind of what we expect. And in fact, the story very much sets us up with that expectation. That's the opening hook. The opening hook is, if you tell the world my secret, I will kill you. Now, okay, just turn off the video right now if you don't want me to spoil The Woman of the Snow. Okay, you had your chance. I'm going to spoil it now. All right, so that story does not end with her killing him at all. He does reveal his secret. He does tell the story of his encounter with the ghostly woman on that night in the blizzard. But he tells this story within a context that's deeply ironic, because he tells the story to the woman herself after she's married him. And not only after she's married him, but after she's had children with him. So they've lived this life, this decade of like shared domestic bliss. They've made a family together. And then he catches sight of her in just the right light, in just the right moment. And she reminds him of the woman he saw, the ghostly spirit that he encountered that night in the forest so many years ago. And because he loves her so much, and because he's so wrapped up in this moment of realization, he tells this woman, who he believes is just his wife and the mother of his children, this story for the first time. And of course, he's actually telling this story to the ghost, to the spirit that he encountered. And the way she handles it is, on the one hand, so unlike what you would possibly expect, and on the other hand, so brilliant and so profound. So what would you think would happen? I mean, so in this moment, there's a thing you're afraid is going to happen, and there is a thing that your like heart and soul wants to happen. Well, there's a thing that like your humanity is crying out for in this situation. So obviously the thing that you're afraid will happen is she's going to walk over, she's going to exhale this white breath on him, and he's going to fall over dead. And the thing you're hoping will happen is that she'll forgive him, that she'll understand the emotion underlying, the love underlying his decision to tell her and only her this story. But no, neither of these expected or hoped for conclusions happens. Instead, she gets up, she confronts him, she tells him to never tell this story to anyone again. She tells him she won't kill him for the sake of their children, and then she just leaves him. She just walks back out into the snow, and we see that big eye in the sky again as she disappears. And that's it. And he's just left alone with the children, left alone with the memory of this beautiful love that he once had. And he's just, in this one moment, both lost the love of his life and been made to realize that he's just spent the last 10 years married to something supernatural, to something ghostly or demonic or otherworldly. And he's just left with the profound emotional weight of this reality, and also with the deep guilt and regret for having said anything at all, for having broken this promise and told this story. And it's wonderful because as a conclusion, it's simultaneously incredibly modern in the way that it totally subverts the audience's expectations, and in the way that it deals with really complex and conflicted human emotions, but it's also deeply mythic. It also still feels like a true ghost story, like a true piece of folklore, because we often associate ghost stories with these moments of tragic irony, these moments where the story comes full circle and there's this deep, dark twist, this kind of weird moment of karmic comeuppance. And it's also really fucking scary. And it's scary for much the same reason that the black hair is scary, because it touches on real human fears, real human anxieties, real human emotion. Like, it touches on the fear that we all have of losing a loved one, of being abandoned, of having to become a single parent, of being separated permanently from a spouse or from a family member. And it deals also with the horror of death and with the question of, would you rather die or lose the person you love the most in the world? And it does it in a way that's completely unique and that's wonderfully complicated, that wonderfully refuses to be simple in its calculations, that avoids the cliches of slasher films and of ghost films and of monster flicks. It's just the basic complicated and conflicted terror of having to live in a world where nothing is permanent, where you could lose anything at any moment, no matter how much you love it, no matter how much you care for it, and that you might be culpable, that you might be responsible for that loss, even though you never intended to be, even through an act that seems completely insignificant, even through an act made out of love itself. And Christ, that's scary. And yeah, I think that's it. I think that's it. I think I'm done. Thank you for bearing with me here. Thank you for listening. I know I kind of went off there. I know this is probably going to end up being a fairly long video. So what I'm hoping to do next is I am hoping to do a second video on Kwaidan. And I'm hoping, fingers crossed, to get it out just in time for Halloween. So stay tuned for that. And of course, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with me here. I hope my voice didn't sound too super weird in this video. I'm just getting over a cold that I've been struggling with for a couple weeks. So if my voice sounds weird or funny, I apologize. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you for watching. Please, if you have it in your heart, if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. Maybe hit that bell icon to be notified of future videos. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone who's stuck with me through all of my videos so far. I really appreciate all the kind and supportive and deeply insightful comments that different people have left. And I'm just rambling at this point. So that's it. Happy Halloween. I'll see you in the next video. Okay. I know what you're thinking. You saw the title to this video and you're thinking, oh no, this is going to be some silly clickbait nonsense. And yeah, okay, maybe I wanted to do a little fun video for the holidays. Maybe this video is going to be a little tongue-in-cheek. And yes, I'm not going to deny it, there's something fundamentally absurd about comparing the holiday classic Miracle on 34th Street to the gritty HBO police procedural The Wire, but bear with me here, because I actually think that there are some surprising points of commonality between the film and the series. And as much as this video is fundamentally a silly little Christmas joke on my part, there might actually be some insights to be had by comparing the two. So one of my family's ongoing holiday traditions is that every Thanksgiving, after we finish the turkey,
after the sun has set and after everyone is completely bloated and lethargic, we all settle down and we watch Miracle on 34th Street. Not the like remake from the 90s, but the 1947 original, the one in black and white. And you know, it's one of the few Christmas films that I feel really holds up, at least for me as an adult now, you know? And I think part of the reason for that is that it just feels a little more sophisticated and a little more intelligent and a little bit more adult, not in a bad way, not adult, but it feels a little bit more mature and thoughtful than your average Christmas film, while still being a purely enjoyable family entertainment. You know, this is not a case where this is it's obviously not some bleak, dark, existential film, right? It's still very much a largely wholesome family film that's perfect to watch with your parents or your grandparents or your aunts or your uncles or your nephews or your nieces or your cousins or whatever on Christmas. But it has just a little bit of sharpness to it, just a little bit of a clever edge, and just this underlying strain of slightly dark, slightly mean-spirited humor that just makes the whole thing come together and work. So this year, for some reason, probably because my brain is fundamentally broken on some level, while I'm sitting there watching this film for the umpteenth time, I have no idea how many times I've seen it, a thought popped into my head. And the thought was basically, this reminds me of The Wire a little bit. Now you might say, that's a pretty weird thought to have. And I will grant that, yeah, indeed, it is a pretty weird thought to have. But I think what planted that weird thought in the back of my mind as I was watching Miracle on 34th Street is the way that it seems oddly similar in structure and approach to The Wire. So to dig into this, let me start by talking about how The Wire is structured as a series. So the series starts off in its first season not exactly as a standard police procedural, but definitely as a police procedural. It's following very closely the lives of detectives and drug dealers and beat cops in Baltimore. And that's the hook for the first season. But something interesting happens as the series goes on, and that's that its scope just keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. And the show keeps growing to encompass more and more of the city of Baltimore and to show us more and more of its corrupt institutions. In the second season, the series adds the docks, and we get to learn how they serve as this kind of point of entry for all the illicit substances that are pouring into Baltimore. And then in the third season, we get to see City Hall and the city government and how all the decisions that are being made on a political level in the city are adding to its corruption and adding to its problems with crime. And then in season 4, we get a look into the public school system and we get to see how its failures are facilitating the poverty and the decay of the city and the hopelessness of many of its residents. And then in season 5, the series expands to look at the newspaper industry, to look at the media, and how crime is spun, and how the tendency towards sensationalism in the media prevents people from really learning about and really addressing the real, deep, pervasive institutional problems in the city. And so with each season, the series keeps growing and expanding outward, and we get these intimate little peeks into these different facets of Baltimore as an ecosystem, and as an ecosystem that's festering from the inside from deep, deep corruption and deep institutional rot. And as the scope of the series continues to expand, so do the number of characters who we get to meet and who we get to be closely acquainted with. It's not as if the series sticks exclusively to one fixed
core group of characters as it explores all these different institutions. Instead, we get to meet different characters who live within these different institutions, who live within these different worlds within the larger world of Baltimore. Okay, all right. So what does this have to do with Miracle on 34th Street? Well, well, actually, Miracle on 34th Street is structured in a very similar way if you think about it. It starts off in many ways as a very traditional Christmas film, focusing on exactly the kinds of characters you would expect a traditional Christmas film to focus on. There's a single mother and her daughter, her precocious daughter. There's the love interest for the single mother, who happens to be this kind of friendly, lovable, attractive bachelor character. And then, of course, there's that element of Christmas magic. There's this elderly gentleman who believes he's Santa Claus. And there's a very traditional movie you could make from that that would focus exclusively on them throughout the story. And in fact, the many, many imitators that have come along to try to ape this formula since the 1947 original was released have mostly stuck to exactly that format. You have a lonely single parent, you have a precocious child, you have a love interest, you have some external source of potential Christmas magic. And that's basically the whole thing. But Miracle on 34th Street doesn't do that. Instead, as its story expands, we keep getting these fascinating and odd little looks into different institutions, just like in The Wire. And yeah, tonally it's very different, although maybe not as different as you'd think, and I'm going to get to that later. But look at it this way. So the film's hook is that Kris Kringle, this fellow who believes himself to be Santa Claus, and may very well be Santa Claus, is hired to work as a department store Santa for Macy's. And so, yeah, of course, this leads to some cute bonding scenes between Kris Kringle and the various kids who come to see him and their parents. And of course, it creates this opportunity for him to bond with the child of the single mother, the single working mother, who's sort of the central character in the film. Yeah, all of that's to be expected, but we also get a lot of scenes about Macy's as a business. And now, don't get me wrong here, these are not hyper serious scenes. It's not as if this film is a documentary on how a department store works. No, this is fundamentally still a family comedy. But nonetheless, you get a lot of scenes that are really kind of fundamentally about corporate politics. You get a moment in the boardroom where Mr. Macy is assessing the strategy of hiring this new Santa Claus and him evaluating the new Santa from a PR perspective. And you get all these funny little scenes of corporate maneuvering and attempts to spin how this Santa Claus is perceived in the media and how that can be used to Macy's advantage. And you also get a lot about the rivalry between Macy's and Gimbel as department stores. And all these things are subtle. These are not things that derail the central heft of the film. But nonetheless, you have this kind of spiraling off. You get to meet all these characters who really live and breathe Macy's as a business and who are primarily motivated by their professional ambition, which is so weird in a Christmas movie. And it's all oddly cynical. And it's all seemingly somewhat tangential to the plot, to the central driving plot of the film. And then a similar thing happens later in the film when Kris Kringle is on trial, when they're assessing his sanity and trying to decide if he should be institutionalized for believing that he's Santa Claus, rather than just remaining tightly focused on Mrs. Walker and her daughter and Fred Daly, who is the love interest and also, of course, the lawyer, and Kris Kringle, and viewing the trial exclusively through their eyes, we get to see little peeks at the lives of all of these other characters associated with the case. We get a look at the life of the district attorney who's trying the case, at the life of the judge who's overseeing the case. We get a look at the political advisor to the judge who's overseeing the case. And that's fascinating. And so we get scenes like the judge being advised on how trying Santa Claus is going to have a negative effect on his reelection campaign, or the relationship between the district attorney and his son, and how the tension there leads into the decisions that he makes about how to try this individual. And even the climatic set piece of the film, the scene that everyone remembers, that famous scene where they carry all the many, many bags of letters to Santa Claus into the courtroom and dump them in front of the judge. Even that scene kind of develops in a similar fashion. We don't just see these letters get delivered to Santa Claus. Instead, we get this little glimpse into the New York City post office where a couple of just random working class guys on the assembly line sorting letters are discussing the situation with the dead letter office and all of these letters to Santa Claus that are piling up and wishing they could do something about it. And we get to see how they have the bright idea of, well, why don't we just dump all these letters on this guy who claims to be Santa Claus? And so even there, we're getting this like little peek behind the scenes into an institution that's critical to the overall development of this plot. And not only that, but we get a little candid look into the life of these two characters who otherwise appear nowhere else in the film. They exist just to have this one comic moment, this one funny moment where they discuss the fate of letters to Santa Claus, and then they're gone. And so you can probably see where I'm going with this. That is very similar to how The Wire is structured, in that you get all of these little peeks into these different institutions, and in that the film just keeps expanding and expanding in scope as it goes. The cast of characters keeps expanding, it's not static, and the cast of characters expands along with the world, the universe of the movie. And yeah, obviously The Wire is much darker, much more gritty, much more bleak in the way that it explores these institutions. The Wire is far more dramatic in tone. And yeah, Miracle on 34th Street is, of course, fundamentally a rather lighthearted comedy. And yeah, all these little peeks into different parts of the world of the film are used mostly for comic effect, not to create this overwhelming sense of these rotten and dying institutions. But, even though they're so different in tone, they're not necessarily that different in theme. Which is to say, both The Wire and Miracle on 34th Street seem to have a fairly cynical view of humanity and a fairly cynical view of politics and institutions and business and on what really motivates us. And I don't think I need to clarify the ways in which The Wire is cynical. It's perhaps one of the most cynical television series ever made. But it might be a little bit harder for you to believe me when I say there's something deeply cynical at the core of Miracle on 34th Street. But listen, this is a film where time and time again, characters largely act out of selfish motivations. The Macy's subplot, as I said before, is heavily driven by the ambition and greed of not only Mr. Macy himself, but also the different individuals who work in the different departments of the store. The decision to focus in on this campaign, this advertising campaign, this PR campaign about how their Santa Claus is willing to send families to other stores to buy the Christmas gifts they can't buy at Macy's is not motivated by the goodness of anyone's heart, except Kris Kringle's heart, right? Except Santa Claus's heart. All of the other actors here are thinking about this as a marketing strategy, are thinking about this as a way to build customer loyalty over time. And once again, like I said before, when it gets to the cart room sections, you see that the judge is motivated by political considerations. He makes decisions not just based on what he thinks the letter of the law is and should be, but based instead on his political ambitions, his desire to be reelected. There's an infamous and I think somewhat legally suspect moment in the film where Daley subpoenas the son of the district attorney and gets him to testify as a means to getting the district attorney to concede the existence of Santa Claus. And so in moments like this, we're not getting the impression that these characters have been truly reformed and truly converted and that they've seen like something fundamental about the spirit of Christmas. Instead, we're seeing them maneuvering in a way that's driven by selfishness. And we're seeing people behave essentially tactically and strategically and cynically. And even Fred Daley himself, who in a different Christmas film would be the unequivocal hero, who would be this well-intentioned, crusading attorney, is sometimes pretty clearly driven by his own self-interest. We see him bragging about the effect that this case is going to have on his career, about how proving this old man is Santa Claus is really going to help him get his leg up in the legal world. And now, of course, it's not that simple and uncomplicated. We also get the impression that Daley is a legitimately good human being who actually cares about Mrs. Walker and her daughter, and who actually has real sympathy and empathy for Kris Kringle. But still, even in the motivations of the film's central hero, there's this little strain of selfishness. There's this little strain of cynicism. And even that big closing set piece that I talked about before with the letters from Santa Claus doesn't come about because the workers at the post office said, hey, you know what? That poor old guy is getting a really bad rap, and I bet he really is Santa Claus, so why don't we send these letters along to help his case? No! It's purely out of personal comfort and a little bit of laziness. It's like, hey, we've got all of these letters here. They're just taking up space. We have to keep sorting them. We have to keep throwing them in the dead letter office. Why don't we just dump them all off on this parsap? It's just a couple of overworked working class guys who see an opportunity to make their lives a little bit easier, make their workload a little bit lighter, and maybe play a fun little prank in the process. And you know, comparisons with The Wire aside, I think this is a big part of what makes Miracle on 34th Street so much more interesting and effective than your average family Christmas film. Because even though it's a lot older than many Christmas films, it already seems to be subverting their formula a little bit. Instead of this straightforward, saccharine story about some cynical businesswoman who goes home and hooks up with some, you know, hometown guy who's simpler and who has a less complicated and more optimistic view of life and who teaches her somehow the true meaning of Christmas. And instead of this being a simple story about someone's conversion from being selfish and self-centered to being purely selfless and purely driven by the sentiment of the season, we get something that's a lot more messy and a lot more complicated. And yeah, that central formula is still present, is still there, but it's surrounded by this whole universe of characters who have their own motivations, who are short-sighted and myopic and driven in much the same ways that, like, we are. It's not a pure, straight morality tale. And also, that makes it much funnier. It makes the jokes land more effectively because you can see that a lot of the jokes in the film are driven by authentic human foibles and pathos and slight corruption and insecurity and ambition, and are not simply a bunch of pratfalls driven by the plot, driven by some desire to insert some slapstick into an otherwise straightforward story. But aside from tone, There's also one big thematic point on which The Wire and Miracle on 34th Street diverge in their visions. And that's the way in which the selfishness and corruption and pettiness and ambition of the characters within this world ultimately influence the outcome of each of these stories. The overall guiding thematic point of The Wire, if you want to like be crass and assign a point to a piece of art, is basically that all of this personal corruption and all of this institutional corruption snowballs and interconnects in a way that just breeds bad outcomes. That there's this interlocking web of corruption and malice that's rooted not in some great evil intent, but that's rooted in how the short-sighted and selfish and opportunistic choices of individuals working within these institutions all interlock and work together to create a world that is essentially hopeless for the people who occupy it. Whereas all these little selfish, petty choices made in The Miracle on 34th Street actually come together to contribute to the film's happy ending. All these silly little actions that people are taking because they're selfish, because they're short-sighted, because they're thinking about their career or their political ambitions, they all snowball together to produce the miracle in the title of the film. And yes, when Fred Daly and Kris Kringle win their case at the end of the film, and when Fred and Mrs. Walker ultimately do end up being drawn into a romantic relationship, on some level that is out of the goodness of their hearts, especially out of the goodness of Kris Kringle's heart, out of the goodness of Santa Claus's heart. But also, it could not possibly have happened if not for all these small individual characters who were driven entirely solely by their self-interest. And so that's what's miraculous about the film. That's the Christmas miracle at the heart of the film, that all of these people acting in a callous and limited and short-sighted way can be drawn into this interlocking web, not for evil, not for corruption and despair, but for good. And I don't know about you, but to me personally, that's just so much more interesting and, yeah, uplifting than a film where someone goes back to their hometown and learns the true meaning of Christmas, you know, because they met some hunk or whatever. And yeah, I think it makes it not only the better film, but the better Christmas film. And so, yeah, that's it. I'm done. Merry Christmas, I guess. And as usual, thank you. Thank you for watching this video all the way through. If you could, if you feel like it, if you're really in the Christmas spirit, maybe hit that like button, maybe hit that subscribe button even, maybe leave a comment. I appreciate all the insightful comments that I've gotten on all my videos. And yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks so much. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Whatever. So I want to do something a little different with this video. I just saw Ridley Scott's film Napoleon, and I just want to do a quick extemporaneous review of the film. I just want to share my thoughts. I just want to give my general impressions and feelings. I don't have notes. I don't have a thesis statement. I don't have some broad overarching theory of the film. I just want to talk about what I liked, what I didn't like, just a general, as I said, review. Okay, so first of all, let me just say there are inevitably going to be spoilers in this review. Since I'm not operating off of a script, and since I'm just kind of going to dump my stream of consciousness thoughts on the film out there, I'm not going to be able to take special care to avoid spoiling anything. Not that I'm particularly worried about spoiling the major plot points of a film that's about the life of one of history's most important figures. I'm not really scared that anyone's going to walk away from this video and be like, he spoiled the life of Napoleon for me. I didn't know what happened at Waterloo. But that said, the techniques that Ridley Scott uses, the way he frames the film, his approach to telling the story are all things that can be spoiled too. Okay, I've procrastinated enough. Let's talk about the movie. So, the thing that really struck me about the film, and perhaps the thing I admire most about it, is its sheer audacity. Listen, this is not at all the Napoleon film I expected going into the theater. And it's probably not at all the movie that your imagination conjures up if someone told you that Ridley Scott made a film about the life of Napoleon. I mean, what are you imagining if I say that? You're probably thinking about large-scale battle sequences, which are in the film, right? But you're probably thinking this is going to be a biopic that really focuses in on Napoleon as a military tactician, that really focuses on his strategic genius, and that really goes out of its way to stage these incredibly complex and sophisticated and beautiful battle scenes, you know, with a great emphasis on action and the carnage of war and all of that. And there's, as I said, there's some of the latter in there. There are a few battles in this film, although certainly less than you would expect given its runtime of 2.5 hours. But that's not really the film that Ridley Scott chose to make. Instead, this is really a black comedy, a very dark comedy with a lot of social awkwardness in it, and with a surprising amount of focus on the relationship between Napoleon and his wife and empress, Josephine. And also a movie that, rather than portraying Napoleon as a genius and as one of history's great men, kind of makes him look like a little bit of a buffoon, and certainly a narcissist, and certainly someone with a real strain of social awkwardness, and really someone who you walk away from the film with an odd mix of contempt and pity for. And listen, I understand that is not the film about Napoleon that a lot of people are going to go to the theaters hoping to see. And in fact, I've already seen like some negative discourse about the film online, some disappointment about its historical inaccuracy, which I'm not really fit to comment on, and which I don't really care a lot about, but also just general backlash to the approach that the film takes. And yeah, I get it. If you were hoping to see the film that I described earlier, and even like the film that kind of the trailers make you want to believe Napoleon is, then yeah, you're going to walk away disappointed. But I have a real deep admiration for Ridley Scott's refusal to make that film. Because listen, we live in an age where movies are unbelievably fucking expensive to make, where studios are very unwilling to take risks, unwilling to take gambles, and where directors are often aggressively pigeonholed into either making the kind of film the studios want them to make, you know, another big budget superhero movie or something like that, right? Or if not that, or at least aggressively pressured to make the kind of film that audiences expect them to make. And the expectation for Ridley Scott is that he's going to make a big budget action film. And on some level, he just decided not to do it. And instead, to make a profoundly, and I hate to use this term, but it's the one that pops into my head, a profoundly quirky movie about Napoleon, and one that's so much more about interpersonal awkwardness than it is about what happens on the battlefield, and so much more interested in the pathology of what happens in Napoleon's bedroom than it is in his skill as a political or military figure or commander. And that's fascinating to me. That's fascinating to me. And honestly, there's something thrilling just about sitting down and watching a movie and having it not at all be the movie you expected to see. And not only for that movie to not be the movie that you expect it to be, but for it to be a really audacious and weird and surprising film. That's just oddly invigorating. It's just a weirdly pleasing experience to have in the cinema in this period, as I said, of real entrenchment of genres and styles and approaches and a real fear of risk taking. This is a tremendously risky film. This is a tremendously risky film that I kind of imagine might not make that much money at the box office, even though it did surprisingly well in its second weekend. But I could see word of mouth harming this film just because, like I said, not only is it a movie that doesn't meet audiences' expectations, but the trailers very much sold a different movie than the movie that audiences ultimately got when they sat down. So yeah, on that level, on the level of its sheer refusal to conform to the expectations of studios and audiences, I liked it. I loved it even. I loved that about it. But there is, of course, another question that I have to answer if I'm going to review the film, and that's, is it a good movie? Is this a successful film? Does this film actually creatively succeed? And I'm a little more on the fence about that, honestly. So let me talk first about what I liked about the film, because I really do want to foreground that, because like I said, I have a lot of admiration for what Ridley Scott is doing here. And one thing I liked above all else is the fact that you can tell that Ridley Scott had a very clear vision for what he was trying to do with this film. That he really very much wanted to make a black comedy about the life of Napoleon with a very keen focus on the pathology underlying Napoleon as a human being. I think he was very much intentionally trying to do a satirical critique of the great man theory of history. And I think he wanted to take someone who's widely seen as one of the greatest and most influential human beings to ever live and to really subvert our expectations and our perceptions of that person, to present them in a less than flattering light, a light that really focuses on their pathos and their insecurity and their social awkwardness and how they might have been perhaps a narcissist, how they might have even overestimated their own abilities. We may talk about whether or not history overestimated Napoleon, but here is a film that firmly believes that Napoleon overestimated himself. And I think whether you agree with that thesis or not, by sticking so closely to that idea, Ridley Scott has produced a film that's very cohesive, that holds together very well, and that has a clear and unequivocal vision. I also think the film really works as a comedy. This is a really funny film. And it's a film that finds its laughs in really unconventional ways. It's almost slapstick, really, in its approach. And I think the comedy in the film works in no small part due to Joaquin Phoenix's performance, which is just so profoundly awkward and uncomfortable. You really cannot predict how he's going to react in any given scene. And I've seen his performance criticized a little bit for this, and I think the people criticizing him kind of misunderstand what movie he's in. Because yes, his performance can seem a little stilted. There are a lot of times where he just sort of stares, where there are these long, uncomfortable pauses after another character speaks to him, or where he responds in a weird or awkward way. And yeah, if this was a serious period piece that was trying to evoke the gravitas of Napoleon, then that would be totally out of place. But this is a movie about social discomfort. This is a comedy about social discomfort and about the way that social discomfort bleeds into politics and about how political discomfort can breed social discomfort and vice versa. And this is a movie, ultimately, about an awkward and pathological man. And so, within that context, Joaquin Phoenix's performance really works, I think. And in fact, I think as a director, Ridley Scott has made some really fascinating choices here that very much complement what Joaquin Phoenix is doing as an actor. There are moments that have been left in this film that feel almost like bloopers. There are scenes that go on just a little bit too long. There are exchanges where there'll be some verbal tick or some minor little thing that Joaquin Phoenix does in his performance, in his acting, in the way he moves, that feels almost like a gaffe. There's a moment with his hat, I believe, when he's talking to Josephine, where he very nearly drops the hat, or he picks up the hat and kind of fiddles with it, and he goes to put it on her head and on his head. And there are a number of moments like that in the scene that have this real feeling of almost unscriptedness. And they're often moments that intersect with Phoenix's performance as Napoleon. And I think those moments really work. First of all, because they're actually funny. They're funny because they're not at all what we expect from this sort of period piece. Usually historical dramas have a real sense of flatness to them, or if not flatness, a real sense of their own importance, right? And of the importance of these historical moments that they're portraying. And this film does everything possible to undermine Napoleon's importance, and especially his self-importance, his idea of himself, as I said earlier, as a great man. And so, since there's this real disconnect between what we're expecting to see on the screen and what actually happens, what can we fill that vacuum with? What can we fill that space between our expectations and reality with but laughter? So we just naturally laugh at something like that because it's so unexpected and so absurd. But even more than that, I think this sort of faux unscripted, gaffy, bloopery seeming approach to filmmaking fits thematically really well with what Ridley Scott is doing, and fits really well with the way that he's portraying this moment in history and the factors at play there. I think this film really wants us to focus on the chaos of this historical moment, on just the absolute unhinged, unpredictable absurdity of the French Revolutionary period and its aftermath. Instead of us seeing this as this moment of great drama and great tragedy and great men, I think he wants us to see a huge historical and political vacuum that's been created by the chaos and unpredictability of a moment of a real social breakdown, right? Social, political, military breakdown. You have this societal collapse. And rather than that being a thing that feels scripted, that feels like it's some grand drama, some great theatrical event, that actually in the moment, it's a mess. It's just wild and unpredictable. And that wild unpredictability creates an opening for people to improvise. And I think that Scott really wants us to see Napoleon as someone who is largely improvising his way to power, as opposed to someone who was just rigorously strategic. And one of my favorite moments in the film is when Napoleon is in the midst of executing this coup against the French Republican government, the coup that would ultimately lead to him being crowned as emperor. And there's this moment where the French politicians are basically refusing to pass a resolution, or whatever you want to call it, that would make Napoleon the de facto dictator of France. And the army is waiting outside to back him up, and he kind of scrambles out of the legislative chamber on his way to inform the military so they can move in and essentially execute the coup. And while he's on his way outside, he falls down the stairs. And the whole sequence really plays like slapstick. Instead of seeming like this meticulously executed coup, instead of seeming like this meticulously executed overthrow of the French government, it just seems like a mess. It just seems silly. And as I said, it just seems like slapstick. It seems more like something out of a screwball comedy than out of a film about this great strategic mastermind. And even in its opening sequence, the film does a wonderful job of undermining our expectations for a grand dramatic historical film and instead presenting something far messier and far uglier and far more interesting. So the film opens with the execution of Marie Antoinette, and when she's being led up to the guillotine to be beheaded, you've got to expect. We have seen this moment in film so many times, in film and television. We've seen so many adaptations of this moment, and you're expecting something really dramatic and really tragic, and you're expecting that to be reflected in the way that the sequence is staged. But instead, even from minute one, like the first thing I was drawn to was how unkempt her hair was, which is such a great subversion of the way Marie Antoinette is usually portrayed in film. She looks exactly as frazzled and messy as you would expect someone being led to their execution to look. And then when they get her to kneel down and place her head in the guillotine, the executioner struggles to slide down the little wooden panel that is going to lock her into place. And you see him fumble with it just for a few seconds, right? It's not something Ridley Scott goes out of his way to draw your attention to, but just that little bit of fumbling, just that little bit of difficulty locking the mechanism in place lets us know what we're in for. Cues us in to anticipate a film where often things are not going to go exactly to plan. Encourages us to look for these moments that feel like gaffes, that feel almost like mistakes, that feel like, oh, maybe the director should have taken another take there. Because hidden in those moments, I think, is the essence of what Scott is trying to do with this film. Okay, so with all of that praise out of the way, why is it that I said before that I was conflicted about this film? Well, honestly, for as much as I admire the fact that Ridley Scott had such a clear and unequivocal vision for the movie, as much as I admire the fact that he obviously made exactly the movie that he wanted to make, and as much as I found a lot of the movie to be legitimately hilarious, including Joaquin Phoenix's performance, I have to say that the movie was perhaps a little too single-minded for my taste, maybe a little too unequivocal in its presentation of Napoleon as this clownish and buffoonish figure. Okay, so now it sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but let me explain. So, first of all, I'm not saying that I wanted a kind of hagiographic presentation of Napoleon. As I said before, I'm actually really down with the idea of presenting a very slapstick look at this moment in history. And I'm also very much down with this kind of blackly comic approach to a moment of great historical importance. And in fact, I absolutely love The Death of Stalin, which also took a very dark and very bleak and very important moment in history and turned it into a very dark comedy full of lots of social maneuvering and weird interpersonal awkwardness. But I don't think this film is quite as successful as that one. And I think this film is less successful in part because its devotion to showing Napoleon as a purely pathological figure prevents the film from becoming very nuanced and very sophisticated in its portrayal of the historical moment that it's trying to capture. Like, I really do think the film wants us to see Napoleon as an opportunist, as someone who was presented with this moment in history where he could rise in spite of his flaws, in spite of his limitations, in spite of his lack of social graces. But the Napoleon that the film gives us is so one note and so boorish and so interpersonally inadequate that we really struggle to see how he could possibly have pulled any of this off. So instead of getting a portrait of a deeply flawed and perhaps mentally ill man who took advantage of a singularly chaotic moment in history to seize power, we get the portrait of a guy who seems to just get lucky again and again and again. It almost has like a Forrest Gumpy or Being There-esque feel to it, where Napoleon seems like such a buffoon that it's almost as if fate just keeps dealing him opportunities to succeed. And we do get a couple of moments where he acts in a strategically smart way, especially in the 4 or so relatively brief battle sequences that are in the film. But even there's a kind of unwillingness on Ridley Scott's part to really flesh out the details of how Napoleon is taking advantage of these situations. And I get the sense that Ridley Scott was so desperate not to portray Napoleon as an exemplary or a genius figure that he may have erred too far in the other direction, and that something a little bit more complicated, a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more nuanced in particular would have been a lot more successful. Similarly, I kind of feel like the way that Napoleon is pathological in the film could be a little more inventive. It's a very, very Freudian depiction of Napoleon. I mean, you outright have a moment where Napoleon flat out compares Josephine to his mother. So it's not subtle at all. The Freudian shit here is not at all subtle. And listen, I don't think that's an intrinsically wrong approach to take. I'm not someone who thinks that psychoanalysis is so inherently disreputable or evil or corrupt that it shouldn't be incorporated into films. No, I think that whether you think a Freudian approach to psychology is valid or not, it can still be an interesting lens to apply when you're studying a character, when you're doing a film that's fundamentally a look at a person who's mentally troubled. But it's such an easy approach to take with Napoleon. Because, come on, Napoleon complex is a term for a reason. It's not as if there's something wholly unique and surprising about looking at Napoleon through a psychoanalytic or Freudian lens. In fact, there's an argument to be made that that's just about the second easiest way to look at Napoleon after the great man thing, after the great general approach. And so that's another area where a little bit more inventiveness and a little bit more nuance would have been appreciated. I also feel like the battle sequences in the film are a little unfocused. It almost seems like there are moments where Ridley Scott is trying to offer us the Ridley Scott movie that we all kind of came to see, especially in the Battle of Waterloo that closes the film. That's a very protracted battle, and it does kind of lapse into that kind of spectacle. But ultimately, the battles in the movie just seemed kind of unfocused and muddy to me. I will say they are chaotic in parts, and I appreciate some of what Ridley Scott is doing here and how it emphasizes like the larger themes of this kind of social breakdown and social chaos. He definitely totally avoids making these battles seem heroic or highly synchronized or highly stylized. You get a really good sense of the chaos and disorganization of war. And you also get a really good sense at the bloody toll of war. And in fact, the Battle of Austerlitz in this film is pretty interesting because this is sort of Napoleon's great strategic victory. This is his moment of most supreme triumph. And instead of fixating on the meticulous movements of armies, on the execution of grand battle plans, a lot of that battle in this film is just images of men slipping under the ice, falling through the ice and drowning, just corpses falling into the frozen lake, just blood filling the water. And that decision to focus on the human toll makes sense with what he's doing elsewhere in the film. But overall, I kind of did feel my attention flagging a little bit once the battles kicked into gear. I will say I wasn't 100% on board with the film's pacing either. There are maybe a few too many scenes between Napoleon and Josephine, or more precisely, there are maybe a few too many scenes between them that are too much like scenes we've already seen between them. There are a lot of shared moments between Napoleon and Josephine that feel a little redundant, that feel like, oh, okay, we already understand that this couple have rather bizarre sexual dynamics. We understand that there's a kind of weird, sort of almost sadomasochistic undercurrent to this relationship, this weird power-sharing dynamic, and we get it. And so we get a lot of very similar scenes that don't enrich and build upon that dynamic. We don't get a sense that, oh, a little bit more is being revealed about the psychology of Napoleon or the psychology of Josephine or the intricacies of their relationship, weird as they may be, with each scene that passes. Instead, it kind of feels like a reset button is hit, and there is a lot of going over the same ground, even if some of those moments are very funny, and I can understand why there would have been a desire not to cut them. Okay, so I feel like I've been rambling for longer than I planned to. I feel like I need to wrap this thing up. So, holistically, at the end of the day, did I like Napoleon? Yeah, actually, I did. If I was going to give it a rating with a generic critic scale, I would say this is kind of the archetypal 3 out of 5 star movie. Meaning it's a good film. It's a good film. It's a good film with a clear idea of what it wants to accomplish. But it doesn't quite accomplish what it wants to accomplish. Or it could have accomplished what it hoped to accomplish in a more nuanced and interesting way. I feel like that was just about the most labored and pretentious way to put it. But you get what I'm saying. It doesn't quite work, but it works more than enough for me to recommend seeing it. Especially in this moment, especially right now, when we're seeing this kind of dual trend of this resurgence of actual author-driven or actual director-driven cinema with films like Oppenheimer and Napoleon and Killers of the Flower Moon. And yet, yes, even on some weird level with films like Barbie, right? And we're also finally seeing a decline in the endless bloat of mechanically processed superhero films and the kind of endless IP zombie films that Disney and company have been pumping out. So in this moment, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. If there's an interesting film out there, and Napoleon is absolutely an interesting film, you should go see it. So yeah, go see Napoleon. I guess that's it. I guess I'm done. All right.
Okay, so that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, if you could like, if you could subscribe, if you could maybe go to my channel and check out some of my other videos if you're still awake. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for sticking around this long. And I'll have new content, completely new content, coming soon. I'm working on a few things. I'm brainstorming some things. I'm thinking of maybe doing some more like literary videos, but we'll see where it goes. Anyway, have a good night. Bye. Hello, Mr. Bones. You want to be a part of the video, Mr. Bones, huh? Yeah? Okay, here. Come here. Come here. Oh. I love you, buddy. You gonna be quiet? Hmm? Mm. Here, I'll include you in an outtake, okay? Okay. Good boy. Down you go.